Skyrim, A Sorcerer's Tale by Rastislav. Chapter 421, Chapter 41, Opening Clashes, Part 2 of 2. Raven's point of view. Scorch lands on my extended hand, and a series of images blasts into my mind. Whoever is leading the central detachment seems smarter than we expected. Scouting with the dreaded Birdman was something I was starting to do consciously, instead of just scrying about. Got my sight blocked too many times to trust it implicitly. How so? Legate Furious asks, his eyes slowly trailing the Kagan Moore phalanx, which was only now, a good 10 minutes after the clash, beginning to reform. Good speed, all things considered. Scorch chirps his boredom and unsummons himself. They sent messengers to the other group. I suspect they will try and unite before investigating our position. Not ideal, the Imperial hums, but not a deal-breaker either. Quite, I nod. I will have the Redaran troops begin harassing them with automatons. That ought to fuck with their morale. The legate gives me a look, constant barrage of bolts. I nod with a far too cheerful smirk. He shivers slightly, poor fuckers. Once more I summon Scorch, who glares at me ineffectively for a moment before launching himself southwards, all the while complaining about lazy-ass elves and their familiar abuse. I naturally tuned him out instantly and turned to face the approaching Almaril casualties. 56 confirmed dead with about 300 injured. He lists off immediately, the rest should be able to march in 5 more minutes. Much better than I expected, if you will excuse the morbidity. I snort lightly. The Redaran veteran just shrugs. I am as surprised as you are. Our advantages were too great and the enemy was unprepared. Best not to rely on such luck too often. I nod along and quickly inform him of our tactical state, leave the first 3 lines here to rest, and have them loot the bodies and burn the rest. Might as well get the fully fresh ones some experience. He considers briefly before nodding, probably wise. Oh, and leave the priest here. I add, he can heal the wounded well enough on his own. He might protest, Redaran points out, more out of obligation than actual care. I just give him a long look at that. He nods and walks back to the formation. Now the waiting begins, I mutter with slight annoyance. General POV. Keep yourselves together, egg brothers. A squad leader among the Argonians hissed desperately as bolts came flying by the dozen each second, shields forward and dragged the wounded to the shaman. Not many of them had died, but minutes upon minutes of constant crossbow bolts were starting to wear on their morale. The squad leader saw a glint of metal in the distance and recognized one of the supposed contraptions the Dunmer now used. Seeing the opportunity, he called, "I see them there in the shrub. With me, brothers. Avenge the fallen." A series of hisses and roars came in response, and they charged forward, ignoring the overall commander's orders to keep back. They were too far to hear her by now anyway. War Mage Dreloth of the Redaran, an unusual sentence, but not a unique one, saw the animals begin to charge after his automatons and immediately commanded them to withdraw, still letting out a rhythmic barrage of bolts so as to keep the fire constant, even as they skittered between the hardened mushroom shrub of Resdain. Now that their formation was broken, the lizards began taking actual casualties. Bereft of cover and a proper shield wall, they were swiftly lead out of the shrub and into an opening surrounded by mushroom trees on all sides. The Redaran warriors pounced on them without a second's hesitation, slaughtering all 300 animals in less than a minute, with no quarter being given. "How is our bolt stock?" Dreloth asked his fellow mage. The young woman looked at the crate beside her for a moment before answering, "Should last us for another raid." "And the battle stock?" She nodded, taken into account. "Very well." He failed to keep his eagerness back. "Have the animunculi restocked and replace any soul gems. We shouldn't give the beasts too much breathing space." The young woman scowled. Any second they spend breathing is too long. On that, they could agree. The claw leader of the central detachment and overall leader of the road, Sally scowled terribly as she saw the bolts begin flying again. At least she managed to stop the idiots from charging after them again. But it was a close thing. "Breathe, Iritza." The voice of the shaman shook her out of her stupor. She kept back a scathing retort and sighed instead, "We are being whittled down here, and it happening by my choice." The shaman, Asira, nodded. "And yet you know the choice to be the right one." She frowned. We should not even be here to begin with. Once more, Asira nods her assent. The great war chief orders as he wills. You are not very helpful, you know that, right? Iritsa quips and raises her shield, stopping a jagged bolt in its tracks. Her shaman friend just smirks at her. Before they could speak any further, though, a familiar noise came from their south, and the unreasonably large specimen leading the southernmost detachment broke through the tree line. She was not completely sure if she preferred a slow death or dealing with that particular idiot, but needs must. She straightened her back, barked out orders for scouts to ready themselves, and marched to meet her colleague. Raven's point of view. My new monocle, besides being incredibly dapper and stylish, of course, had a neat zoom-in function, as I soon found, and could be used in tandem with my not-at-all broken sight beyond sight. Which is why I found myself lazing atop Glitterhoof and staring at a pair of Argonians yelling at each other. The female-looking one scowling at the near troll-sized lad as they seemed to be stuck on their next step, the shorter one only retaining any kind of authority due to her higher position, keeping her failure from dragging her down from what I could decipher of the hissing contest they called a language. And even if I could not, the void's blink could, and it very much liked what it saw. Almaral, I call out. The elf turns to me and salutes. They are stuck in fighting. I grin at him. You better promote whoever did the harassment. The mage next to him beams. Ignoring him outright, I look back to the enemy. Get the boys and girls ready. We are not missing this chance. As much as I could just incinerate the whole bloody lot of them immediately, I was not trying to prove my personal power here. No, to achieve what I wanted in Morrowind, I would need to show my ability to lead, and show it I would. General POV. Iritsa finally managed to convince the big lump to stop with his idiocy and turned back to the actual battlefield, her frustration swiftly being exchanged for an actual plan of action. They've wasted enough time on foolishness already. Or at least that is what she was about to do before a single thunderous word cracked the air. FUS. Her line of soldiers were thrown back, the force more than sufficient to lift them off the ground, but thankfully not to harm any of them outright. It did, however, leave the entire center of their formation open, and a force of light Imperial cavalry was perfectly prepared to use said opening. They slammed into the still recovering warriors, throwing them about and impaling them on their spears, but never slowing down as they burst through the line and began wreaking havoc on the lizard folk's backlines. A few were dragged down and slain, more than a few in fact, as an Argonian could jump pretty high when motivated, but their comrades knew better than to stop and help them as they kept riding and soon made their escape south, leaving behind them a thoroughly ravaged force of 5,000 Argonians. Very few corpses, but far too much damage nonetheless. Damage that was soon exploited by a group of just under 1,000 charging elves, the red scarab on their heavy, well-made armor making their allegiance obvious as they slammed into the twice-over disorganized formation and began cutting down everything they could reach with their long blades and expertly blocking counterattacks with their shields. But to her terror, Iritsa found that this was not the worst part of the attack. No, the far too effective charge did not come even close to the sheer terror she felt as two figures, one wearing gleaming white and gold, and the other ominous black and purple, cut through a part of the formation on their lonesome, spraying blood in each and every direction, without slowing down for even a moment. The crowned black and purple one did not even look at her fellow claw leader, as he bifurcated him with a lazy swipe of his one-bladed sword, his other hand slamming a jagged dagger into a nearby claw guard who tried avenging his charge. Another attempted jumping him, only for the sword to suddenly extend into a glaive, cracking the impaled one more than stabbing him as he was broken in multiple pieces in an instant. The now extended glaive swinging down in a perfectly fluid motion and cracking through a shield warrior's guard, and then his head. Iritsa was not a fool, she was a chiefess back home and was thus privy to at least some information on the politics of the wider world. Knowledge she thought would serve her well in future negotiations. Knowledge that took all the fight out of her in an instant. For the purple, three-eyed beetle emblazoned on the crowned one's cloak could mean only one thing: death. Just as she began panicking, her mind already moving towards the obvious decision, she heard Asira shouting at her, pointing at another two groups of Dunmer spearmen, about 1,200 strong each, now marching on their flanks and advancing through her beleaguered kin with careful coordinated steps. Shit. She surmised her thoughts perfectly. She knew she still held the numbers, but her kin were too disorganized from the cavalry charge to put up a true fight, and the duo of champions, currently hewing through her subordinate leaders, killed any attempt at reorganization in its infancy. A small part of Iritza's experienced mind noted how it almost felt like her formation was struck and broken in the exact position that would do the most damage. The slaughter of her kin being committed with such effortless precision, it felt unnatural. Not too long after that realization, she began ordering a retreat, one she knew would not be a fighting one. As she threw a wounded egg brother over her shoulder, she felt the telltale hiss of magic behind her and turned just in time to see Asira grasping at her staff with both hands and trembling violently. Nothing else was visible, but she could feel the immense force slamming onto her friend and knew there was not much time. But just as she thought of running to save her, she felt herself being shoved back slightly, Asira's pleading gaze telling her to run as quickly as she could. With great hesitation, she nodded and turned away, almost immediately hearing a loud crunch and a squelch, but refusing to slow down as she began running away. She felt a new hatred burning in her heart, not for the Dunmer, but for the fools who wished to reignite yet another needless war for their bruised egos. Raven's point of view. Wow, that was dumb of her. I blink as I feel the self-sacrificing idiot get crushed in my telekinetic grip. Why the fuck would you waste your attention while you are actively having your limbs broken? Shaking my head at the wasted chance of capturing a shaman for some magical research, I felt Anandor approach me and lightly tap my shoulder. I gave him a questioning glance he could feel through my crown, and he simply pointed at the approaching Legion cavalry. Legate furious, looking not quite furious, but at least a bit irritated as he rode up to me. "We couldn't chase all of them down, sir." "Oh," I raise an eyebrow. "The Argonians," he scowls. "They managed to breed some massive swamp lizard and are using it as a mount. The horses won't go anywhere near the things. And to make things even worse, the damn things and their riders are armored in steel plate." "Interesting." I mutter. "Well, our goals have been accomplished anyway. We best get back to Kagan Moore before the newbies start pissing themselves from the smell." The veterans around us share in a bout of chuckles, but soon get to work. Loot was loot, and no soldier would ever ignore it, especially since I told them I would not be taking my leader's share of it. Idly, I notice a literal limbless nugget of an imperial woman surrounded by a bunch of Argonian corpses and lift her up telekinetically. Fucking madwoman was still alive. I whistle internally as I begin stabilizing her, and she is glaring at me. Minthara would definitely like her. General POV. She skittered soundlessly through the lightless night, her many legs giving her perfect leverage to move across the rocky terrain and avoid being noticed at once. Just as Mother intended. The Lord of all Spiders had finally called for her, nearly a cycle after improving her so drastically so that she may serve more ably. Mother's gaze was on her, she knew it and would not fail in her task. That she got a delectable meal out of it was just a nice little bonus, of course. A noise drew her many-eyed attention as she barely felt one of the succulent little lizards shrouded in shadow step atop one of the uncountable webs she wove. The shadow scale, one rather worried about his apprentice's recent failure to report back, stepped through the rocky outcroppings overlooking Kagan Moore, a pair of powerful scrolls of illusion and anti-scrying hanging off his hip as he prepared to infiltrate the enemy city. The war chief was against this course of actions, but unlike what most would think, shadow scales care for their own. And yet even as he prepared himself, he felt his instinct scream at him in warning, immediately throwing himself to the side, only to see absolutely nothing. But while he could not see anything, he could smell it. Poison, Skyrim spider variant, greatly enhanced, potential migration and adaptation, or purposefully warbred. These thoughts raced through his mind as he clambered up a large dried-out mushroom in less than a second. And straight into his doom. Even his honed reflexes failed to react as he came face to face with a downright gargantuan frostbite spider. A frostbite spider seemingly made of orichalcum. He did not even get to scream as he was grabbed with numerous pincers, his limbs freezing as immensely potent paralytic entered his bloodstream. Would the fear musk of the lizard Make the meat better or worse? She wondered idly as she spun her cocoon. Eating simply for the sake of survival was something the Lord of all Spiders considered a sad thing, and so she taught herself to truly partake of her meals for the first time. So long as she did her duty first, of course. New tastes and experiences or not, Nimmy would feast well tonight. Chapter 422. Chapter 42, A Full Hand. General POV, 1 foot before the other, 1 foot before the other, was all his mind could focus on as he kept himself moving forward, barely managing not to disturb the others marching beside him as he forced air into his lungs. His hands still shook from the feeling of an Argonian monstrosity trying to yank his spear from his grip. The beast was so much stronger, and yet, Iril, the young cobbler from the poorer parts of Kagan Moore, just another face in the numberless masses really, shook his head and refocused once more on moving his feet. The gambeson he wore smouldered under the harsh Morrowind sun, the rough fabric sticking to his skin as if it were made to be as uncomfortable as possible, the only thing managing to distract him from his discomfort being the constant clack of wood and metal caused by near 3,000 elves marching as one. A cart pulled by a large gar passed him by, the loot taken from the invaders stacked neatly atop it. Their glorious leaders, he supposed, they did lead them to devastating victory after all, told them everyone would get their share once they came back to the city, and while some grumbled, no one wanted to waste more time in that corpse-covered field. "You all right there, young'un?" An old gravelly voice drew him from his thoughts. Iril startled, but managed not to disturb the formation as he turned to look at the one addressing him. The old Mer, simply known as Grey to most, and the leader of his unit, was grinning at him, the old one's chainmail glinting proudly below his breastplate and a sheathed saber waving slightly from his hip as he looked down at one of his charges. "I am fine," is all Iril could say, the ash raised by the march making any kind of talk an effort. He was almost jealous of his superior's better equipment, but Grey's story was one many knew, and not a unique one either. So many veterans of the previous invasion had lost so much. "We did good today," Grey interrupted his thoughts again, the old Mer's voice sounding wistful, almost feels like a dream to lose so few. Iril blinked and hissed, still making sure not to draw too much attention. "Over 100 of us died." Grey just snorts in response. "If this were the first invasion, we'd have probably lost more than half, and that is without victory being certain." The young elf found his words failing him, so all he could do was direct a horrified look at the old one. "Don't give me that look, boy." The old elf snorts again, though one far less humorous this time. "Our leaders back then weren't crafty enough to use the lizard's weight and size against them. Best they could do was give us a shield and tell us to buy time." He scoffs, "And I didn't even dream of getting armor before proving myself." "So all of this," Iril looks around baffled. "Yes, we needed a child of the devil to show us how to fight," the old Mer says dryly. The younger elf once more gives him a horrified look. Grey just shook his head. "Don't worry, those high and mighty types never care about what we say anyway." "Well?" Iril felt a spark of indignation within his chest. "Child of the devil or no, I for one am quite happy he came here." The old elf chuckles dryly. "I ain't stupid enough not to be grateful he saved our asses. Just an old man yapping on about the world turning on its head is all." Just as Iril was about to continue the conversation, they both heard heavy hooves striking the ground and turned to see the very figure they were discussing passing them by. Lord Dagoth's glowing eyes scoured the formation briefly before he ever so slightly nodded and moved forward. "Sweet fucking good Daedra," he heard Grey hiss, all too happy to not draw more attention from the elf who took an entire flank on his own. He looked back to the old elf. "What is it?" "Can't you feel it?" Grey asked instead of answering, and Iril found that he could. The stiffness of his limbs, the sores and blisters on his feet. All of it healed as if it were never there. Grey shivered. One fucking look. Iril did not need much elaboration on that. "Come on, kid." Grey clapped his shoulder before he could ponder what had just happened any further. "He probably wants us not dallying if he bothered healing us. The city is minutes away anyway." They kept marching on silently, even as the very air surrounding them felt reinvigorated, and the grumbling and belly-aching of those around them stopped entirely. Soon the walls of Kagan Moore came into their sights, and Iril couldn't help but smile happily as he saw the crowd gathered just after the great gatehouse. Then, after a bit of searching, he saw his sister's relieved face and felt for certain that all the blood and death had been worth it. Raven's point of view. Having just listened to Almiral's quick report, I nodded in approval. The second clash in today's skirmish, and it was but a skirmish, make no mistake, was a bit more messy and at least 4 times as long as the first, but our casualties only more than doubled by the end of it, leaving us with 173 dead, with the wounded and crippled simply not being a factor due to my presence. No prisoners were taken either, with most of them refusing the very idea of surrender, and those that weren't so reticent not actually speaking Tamrielic or Dunmeri proficiently enough to actually ask for mercy. That and most of the Dunmer, recruits or not, pretended they heard nothing and just stabbed them anyway. The woman I picked up from the sea of corpses would live as well, even if the supposedly insane Brewman, going by the words of Furious, would probably just throw herself into certain death the moment the next battle came. She apparently had a death wish or something, quite stupid, but I wasn't about to bother myself with that when there were more important things to consider. Like the barley-contained bunch of recently returned soldiers staring hungrily and greedily at a group of Redaran and Sadras elves currently calling out names and giving out shares of the collected loot. If the one named was dead, then the families would be called and the loot would be joined by an extra sum of septims. Not the perfect solution, but the families seemed to appreciate it. So who was I to complain? All in all, a rather successful first skirmish, wouldn't you say? I ask aloud to the House representatives surrounding me. The gods have given us a great victory. Veyrin Indoril inclines his head, his 2 pet Ashlanders standing silently behind him. Regnild Sadras snorts derisively. I am sure Boethia got a good show of it, but I doubt they needed to give much help with how easy all of that felt. There is a reason the Telvanni were targeted first, even if the greatest vendetta of Argonia was on the Dres. Having a powerful mage on our side is not something to be ignored. Almiral Faran points out simply that I didn't use any great spells did not mean magic was not in play, and the veteran Redaran knew it. Do not grow overconfident, however, this was but a scouting party. A bit more than a mere scouting party, I'd say. I say as I turn around, can't really expect to hold ground with only that, and we know they were trying to cut us off, at least start doing so. The Redaran inclines his head slightly, a paraphrase if you will. Fair, fair. I nod along. In any case, I doubt the lizards will be all that happy to leave their noses blooded without looking for a way to retaliate soon. My words are met with grumbling agreement. I look to Redaran. Do you know any place they may attack beside just throwing themselves at the wall? Beside where we just met them? Almiril asks rhetorically. Not much beside some of the nearby villages and the Quama mine. Ah, there it is. The Quama mine. I repeat dryly, the same Quama mine which has great cultural and economical implications to the people of Morrowind. That Quama mine. Almiril stops moving entirely for a brief moment before sighing, yes, Lord Dagoth, that Quama mine. Right, I drawl. Well, we didn't waste 4 hours bloodying our troops just so some cheeky lizard can ruin their morale all over again, so I will be going to ensure nothing happens there. You all will stay here and keep preparations going. Anandor gives me a well-concealed look of pure frustration. You will be going alone. I will bring Junior with me. I shrug. You can kill some time by trying to find some talent among the recruits. Might as well start training those worth training to do more than just poke forward. He just shakes his head, keeping his grumbles to himself. If that is all? I ask the rest of them, and receiving no answer, I nod and sprout my wings, drawing immediate looks of surprise from most of them as I soared into the skies and began flying northwest. The mine should be only a few minutes of flying away, so all I will have to do is set up some traps, right? General POV. Gods damn it all, girl, stop cackling and start killing. He roared as his metal whip flashed out, the heirloom weapon's fear enchantment sending the massive lizards the Argonians were riding, stumbling away in terror, one of them even rolling over its rider and killing it with a loud snap of bone. Oh, don't be like that, Merrin. The madwoman huffed. I need you to position them neatly first. I am not made of magicka, you know. That would have been easier if she didn't waste their first chance and let their bodyguards die uselessly. Fucking do it anyway. He yelled back and yanked his head away from a particularly cruel-looking cleaver sword. Fine. The Telvanni shrew shrieked, Taste fire, you animals. A fireball struck a trio of riders who were attempting to flank around them, the rest of the mounts of the dozen or so attackers once more recoiling in fear, much to the apparent fury of their riders. And I am out. The far too cheerful mage clapped her hands, uselessly slumping against a nearby wall as she did so. Merrin Zadir of Great House Dries felt like throttling the little girl foisted onto him by the Telvanni, but luckily for the damn incompetent, his enemies still held most of his fury. The animals, seeing as their heavily armored mounts were proving a detriment, began dismounting, their massive leader leaping off his own mount effortlessly and immediately flowing into an overhead swing with that same massive cleaver sword. Merrin barely managed to deflect the strike without losing every bone in his shield arm. Dropping his whip and drawing his sword, he tried stabbing the lizard through his eye, but only managed to scrape his brow as his opponent dodged to the side. Another two lizards joined the fight, forcing Merrin back on the defensive as all he could do was deflect their flurry of blows, mentally counting down the time the rest would need to reach him. Oh, the shrew suddenly cheered, I forgot I had those. In the next instant, a blast of bright blue lightning nearly blinded him as a bolt of chain lightning instantly killed 5 of the lizard men, leaving only 4 of them alive and currently hissing a furious battle cry. Taking his chance, Merrin slammed his shield into one of the animals and stabbed the other through the heart, kicking the leader in the knee and buying leverage to back away as the massive Argonian tried decapitating him on reflex. By the webweaver, if we survive this, I am going to fucking murder you, Carvani. Swearing by the webweaver only means you are lying. The little shit sing-songed as she pulled out another scroll, but before she could cast the spell it held, one of the animals wizened up and launched its spear at her, striking her in the shoulder and practically nailing her to the cave wall as she shrieked in pain. The leader of the Argonians pressed the attack, finally managing to break Merrin's shield as the Dres was momentarily distracted. He tried pulling out a side knife, but another of the Argonians slammed into his side with a shield of its own, sending him sprawling onto his back. Everything turned oddly quiet as the leader went to strike him down, only for a blade to emerge from the lizard's chest, numerous bloody fractures spreading through his body from the original wound, effectively disintegrating him as the damage became too great. The body fell apart and revealed a shrouded elven figure. It couldn't possibly be an Argonian, but Merrin was understandably distracted as he saw something else behind the elf. A downright massive specimen of spider was currently dragging one of the animal's mounts and spinning it into a cocoon as the beast wailed weakly under the no doubt murderous poison. Merrin rose his hand to warn the elf, causing him to turn around, and what followed was something he fully suspected was an illusion. As the elf unsummoned his ebony crown and approached the spider without a hint of fear, and then began to fucking pet it. Who is a good girl? The elf cooed in a rich and powerful voice, yes you are, and kept fucking petting the giant metal spider Merrin was fucking done with today. Chapter 423. Chapter 43, New Recruits. Raven's point of view. I am really going to need to set some boundaries with Mephala if this shit keeps happening. I grumble internally as I keep patting and cooing at the surprisingly cute spider. Now there was a sentence I never expected to even think. Still, as annoyed as I was with my eldritch horror demonic patron, maybe friend, the glint of intelligence in Nimhe's too many eyes meant she was now far, far more useful than she could ever have been without Mephala's interference. Still fucking annoying she didn't bother asking. Damn it, will you stop that? A voice both frustrated and mildly terrified drew my attention, causing an immediate chitter growl to come from the annoyed spider. Turning to the obvious noble, I simply rose an eyebrow. What? He pointedly did not flinch back, even if I could feel his desire to, and instead looked to the heavily bleeding and rather unconscious mage still sticking to the wall. She is going to bleed out soon, and we ran out of healing potions. And that is my problem how? I ask probingly, even as I begin walking to him and leave Nimhe to her meal. What were you doing in this mine anyway? Just help me save her and I will answer any questions you may have. He grits his teeth. I do not need her master on my backside. A master's apprentice, eh? I ask and telekinetically yank the spear out. I could hear the capitalization in the title, and that meant a Telvanni of great influence. The unconscious woman let out a grunt of pain as blood began to gush out, but I quickly dealt with that with an admittedly inefficient burst of restoration. I really need to master that particular school sometime soon. I've been delaying it for a while now. The only other elf present looked just about ready to protest as I tossed the spear away, but was promptly shut up by the ensuing burst of healing. He gives the perfectly healed woman a baffled look before looking back up to me. Who even are you? I believe it is polite for one to introduce themselves first. I quirk an eyebrow. Besides, I am the one asking questions here. Right. He hides his annoyance well, an arrogant one, but not an idiot. My name is Merin Zadir of Great House Drez. She. He points at the calmly breathing woman. Is Sina Carvani, apprentice of Divaith Fear, and the reason we were here in the first place. Fire. Finally something interesting, and I am guessing the old coot is the one that sent you here. Zadir looks at me with barely contained horror, but shakes it away quickly enough. Yes, her master sent her with some vague instructions and used a favor owed to him by my house to have me and my men accompany her. Your men? I look around the cavern, not a very good showing for a commander to be the last one standing. Shove off, he growls. We did not expect to find a unit of Argonian heavy cavalry in the midst of attacking a Quama mine. Argonians aren't even supposed to have proper mounts. All I am hearing is excuses. I drawl, making the poor fucker shake in fury. Is the Quama queen still alive at least? He bites down his anger, clearly aware of how utterly fucked he would be if he tried acting on his anger, and nods. Yes, we managed to stop them before they could get into the actual mine itself. Well, you managed that at least. I grin and clap him on the shoulder, startling the absolute shit out of him by appearing right next to him in an instant. However, I am sad to say your work isn't quite done yet. Oh. He looks up to me, much more cautious now, and how so? You, my dear friend, are being conscripted. I keep patting his shoulder. Those were not the only Argonians fucking about, and I need all the bodies I can get. You are not really giving much information here. He points out as I turn back to Nimhi, who was now stacking her cocoons atop each other, neatly preparing them for transport. It was so damn meticulous, even I felt a shiver of fear. Well, I won't say no to avenging my men, Merin says after a long pause, purposefully not pointing out the whole conscription bit and choosing to wait and see. Wise, he picks up what looks to be a metal whip from the ground and starts dragging Dunmer corpses around. Still not going to introduce yourself? He asks as I begin helping him with some light telekinesis. You can call me Raven, I inform him nonchalantly. He stills Raven as in... I just grin at him. Well, fuck. He grumbles and gets back to work. My non-combatant subordinates are hiding out in a nearby village. Merin tells me as we finish cleaning up the battlefield and checking on the Quama, odd creatures those, they should have a gar cart. Go on and fetch them then. I wave him away with only a bit of condescension. I could use a bit of quiet after days of dealing with people. I know that feeling, he grumbles and walks off, shaking my head and ignoring the far too cheerful spider currently staring Scorch down as he taught her his ways. I summoned a plush chair and my orb. First I messaged Minthara, who naturally immediately began complaining about me getting all the fun while she had to deal with stupid nobles, a couple of whom thought my absence a moment of weakness and tried acting devious. Jackal had them metaphorically drawn and quartered within a day. Apparently, Titus decided she needed to be a bit more proactive and sent her out to do some actual work, purposefully stepping on the toes of the Fighters Guild by having her go on a hunting spree, of both beasts and bandits for absolutely free, growing her reputation while at the same time humiliating the current leader of the aforementioned guild into finally ceasing her act and lowering the guild's prices. That should help a lot of the more remote settlements quite a bit. Sure, high nobles such as myself did not need to worry about the rise in prices, but some people depended on the protection of the guild. and getting fleeced by their protectors was not a good way to inspire public trust and peace. I did have to make Minthara promise not to interfere in the whole Argonian war unless I asked. This was my opportunity to grow in influence and power, and while being seen as tightly allied to the Empire was a good thing for my future plans, being seen as overly reliant on them would just make me out to be the puppet. She was not the only one I contacted, though. My subordinates in both the Imperial City and Silrun Fell were running things quite smoothly, even if the latter had been quite emptied by my call to arms. Because of fucking course, I would use this chance to enter an army into Morrowind, duh. The mighty and awesome lizard wizard was quite dismayed, or as dismayed as he could really get with how he was, by the news of the Argonian attack, but told me that as long as I did not go too far, he would consider it simple politics. Going too far here, meaning me turning into a filthy slaver, of course, so I was safe there. Torrig was doing quite well for himself, Tryggvi was growing well, and the entirety of Skyrim was celebrating the news of Elisif's second pregnancy. Speaking of my second homeland, the whole place was currently in a period of massive growth. The numerous infrastructure projects with Titus's personal seal alongside Torrig's near absolute authority completely removed most of the red tape the Jarls and Thanes used to keep their influence in the past, allowing the dedicated High King to focus fully on development with no bullshit coming in the way. Here is to hoping all of it doesn't get burned when the time comes. The final person I contacted was my maternal grandfather. I considered not bothering him with this whole situation, but doing that was just plain cowardly, so the moment I informed him of what was going on, he made the only reasonable decision in his eyes. He shoved the Archmage position onto Phineas, to the Lich's immense protests, of course, and was probably already flying across the Velothi Mountains at this very moment. Should I try recruiting him into the house just so I can say I have more than one Archmage? A thing to ponder for later. "You!" the now conscious woman shrieks. I, having felt her get up, turn to her with an expression of pure boredom. "Did you really just try to startle me?" No? She tries and utterly fails to lie to me and immediately forgets the entire situation an instant later. "Anyway, are you Dagoth?" I close my eyes and take a long breath. She is far too energetic for someone who nearly got impaled to death. "Yes, why?" "Oh, good." She claps her hands. "Master told me to tell you that he told me to serve as best as I am able while you play at politics. He is really excited about your presence and wants to see what you can cook up." "Divaith fire," I say slowly as I remove my monocle and lightly massage my forehead with my free hand. "Is excited that I am here?" "Well, yes," she claps her hands again. "He is quite obsessed with your ancestor." "Do you have to keep yelling?" I ask, filing the actual information away for later. That could either be great or terrible depending on the situation. She tilts her head. "I am not yelling, though." "Of course," I sigh. "What can you do that would make you useful anyway?" "I am an expert in destruction magic." She points up proudly. I pause and that is it. She chirps before pouting. "Miss Alf always complains how I focus too much on it, but Master encourages me to keep at it." "Ah, yes," I nod along with a dry tone. "The if explosions are not solving your problems, you are just not using enough school of thought." Her eyes light up. "Exactly." I admit I partake of it sometimes too. I smirk. Though we will have to leave that for later, Merrin and his goons are coming, and I don't feel like wasting 3 more hours here by having to explain I'm not about to eat their souls or something equally retarded. "But eating souls is bad for you." She sounds genuinely confused. I close my eyes, count to 3 and say, "The peasants don't know that." "Oh." She claps her hands again. "That makes sense." "Of fucking course it does. Having left a whole-ass feast for Nimi as I had to barter for a cocooned and still living big lizard, we returned to Kagan Moore a few hours later. There was no panic amongst the officers as I sent Scorch to inform them of the delay, and the house nobles were more than happy to receive more help, no matter how low in number. Merrin seemed to have some kind of problem with the priest, but so long as they didn't try shit, I wouldn't bother with their idiocy. Apparently the reputation of the Indoril for their cowardice and flippancy in faith has not lessened even after a few centuries, and the Dres were really fucking pissed at them due to not getting much help when the Argonians took most of their domains. The Dres was assigned to the Redaran regulars, as he did not have any forces of his own. He did not complain much. Sadras and myself, on the other hand, were really trying to tolerate the far too energetic Telvanni, who had turned downright apoplectic when she learned I had been giving out free lessons for days now and she had missed them all. I shoved Scorch at her and told them to go fuck with the enemy camp. That ought to tire the madwoman out at least. Almeril was all too happy to ignore the presence of the duo now that they had jobs to do, and instead asked me about the mine and its current state. When I informed him how we all left, he questioned me on the wisdom of leaving it unprotected. I just waved his concerns off. That place was now more impenetrable than the city. General POV. If any sentient being was present in the outer shafts of the Kagan Moore Kwama mines, they would likely defecate their previous meal or flee as swiftly as their legs could take them, as the utterly terrifying noise of a spider currently constructing a death trap of metallic webs trying to hum a song rang out through the empty stone halls. Raven's point of view. Days had passed since the Kwama mine incident, and I once more found myself under the setting sun, looking south in the direction of the Argonian camp, now joined by a relaxed Savos Aran. The way he just dropped from the skies one day and introduced himself was something I would remember for decades, especially with everyone's eyes attempting to escape their skulls. We should be ready by now, I say after a long bout of silence. We should, yes. Savos nods, so long as we did not underestimate them. Underestimating Argonians is said to be a terminal illness in recent centuries. I quip with a chuckle. But there is caution and then there is paranoia. Yes, how very wise of you, Raven. He rolls his eyes. I naturally offer a flamboyant bow in turn. I learn from the best, of course. He nods proudly. Shalazar is such a great teacher. I elaborate, sighing dramatically at the absence of the Great One. Humph, Savos huffs. Children these days have no respect for their ancestors. I turn to him with a raised eyebrow. I know you are an old fart, but you don't have to advertise it. Is the Morrowind air bad for you? Do you need a nap? He grumbles to himself about never getting a win and pointedly shifts the topic. Did you finally manage to discover what is up with the lizards? Yup. I nod. Had to contact Tolfdir and Phineas for it, but they helped me narrow it down greatly. Appears to be a standardized ritual to call for aid from the Hist. Thankfully not one where they turn actual Argonians into their own mounts, though. So, much like we originally expected. He nods. It is unusual, but I doubt it will give them that much of an advantage. You never know, I shrug. They won't be too useful in a siege, but discounting them as a threat is not something I am about to do. Fair enough. Savos hums, pulling out a smoking pipe he got recently and lighting up something that is no doubt illegal in most provinces. I do much the same, though without a pipe, as I am not an old fart. A few minutes pass in silence before Savos speaks up again. Raven, what do you plan on doing with Morrowind? I hum lightly for a few seconds. I honestly am not sure. Your actions say otherwise. He points out there was no accusation in his tone, merely curiosity. It depends, I say after a few more silent moments. Either the great houses kick themselves into gear and do as I want them to, or I drag them kicking and screaming into a better future. Savos chuckles, causing me to look back at him, only to snort as he offers a dramatic bow as he drawls, "Hail, O chosen Hortator." I just raise my nose at him and huff in disdain. I did not correct him, though. Chapter 4, 124. Chapter 44, They Come. Savos and I kept chatting throughout the night, him talking about the new batch of students, now including numerous Nords, due to the rising reputation of Magi within Skyrim and Winterhold specifically. He was sad he had to give up his position to Phineas, but one did not simply leave their sole remaining family when they were capable of helping. He waved it all off by saying it was nice to be back home at least, but I could feel his sense of loss, well hidden as it was. Teaching gave him purpose for centuries before I came, and the fact he left it to help me was quite heartwarming, I will admit. Well, so long as traveling cross-continent to commit mass killing upon another sapient species can be considered heartwarming anyway. I, on the other hand, told him about my own experiences, the slowly building disdain for the mundanes of the Empire, and my decisions made during my stay in the Heartlands. He chided me for some rasher decisions and gave me a bit of perspective on the whole overpowered immortal mage, surrounded by weakling mortals situation. Not that I was going fully power mad, merely ensuring the little spark did not grow into something I would not recognize later on. Sure, I could rationalize the disdain away in my mind, but having someone who went through the whole thing explain his own, much greater experiences was incredibly helpful in setting me on the path to actually internalizing my thoughts. Anyway, the conversation inevitably ended up moving to more inane topics, as they usually do when one can keep themselves active and concentrated for weeks without sleeping straight, and we ended up discussing the weather and climate of all things. To think it was already winter, and Morrowind still felt like a fucking desert half the time. My gaze unconsciously moved northeast. The still smoking red mountain was like a cancerous scar upon the horizon. Before my thoughts could further follow that line, I felt Scorch approaching, the fiery bird shrinking in real time and nearly smashing his current rider atop the walls as he plopped his ass on my shoulder in the blink of an eye. I gave Carvani a quick look, realized she was already dozing off due to exhaustion, and promptly decided to ignore the perfectly healthy woman with a deranged smile on her face. "Pops," Scorch spoke up. "They are moving." I look up at him. "How many?" "Like 35,000 or something?" He tilts his head cutely. "So many of the bloody farm tools ended up burrowing into the ground due to overcrowding that I may have missed a few." He shrugs his wings. "Shouldn't be too many for us to take down anyway." "And what of shamans and chieftains?" Savos asks. Scorch taps his beak for a few seconds. "They have some pretty good ones, a few master level, but I don't know what their specialization is. Their leader is one big motherfucker, though." "Bigger than the usual big ones, then?" "Oh? Oh yeah?" Scorch bobs his head back and forth rapidly. "Big albino motherfucker looks more like a small troll than any farm tool, really." Both Savos and I frown immediately, our eyes meeting in brief discussion before the both of us nodded. That may complicate things somewhat. I mutter, "We will go with capturing him for a search for now, unless things get really out of hand." "That is probably wise." Savos agrees somewhat awkwardly. "Go and call the War Council," I interrupt any further discussion, "and tell Almeril to begin gathering the militia." He bobs his head and jumps into the air, heading to the city hall turned military base. "Do you think we may be wrong?" Savos asks. My face scrunches up slightly, my voice as dry as a desert. We both had the same immediate hunch. We are both diviners. I think not. Savos sighs. All the elves and one human of note gathered within minutes atop the bastion Savos and I had appropriated for our impromptu lounge. News were shared, information went back and forth, and when the numbers came, panic inevitably spread. Hell, even Almeril looked just a tad disgruntled. The only person that was not currently shitting their metaphorical pants was furious. But that was honestly unsurprising. None of them were terrified, though. They merely lacked faith. Rolling my eyes, my rear still firmly planted in my seat, I simply asked, "Are you sure you are done, Mary?" Because I am hearing a lot of Ultima cowardice being spouted. A burst of my divine presence flicked into existence for but a moment. Merrin blinks a few times, shakes his head and scoffs. "You can't actually expect us to hold this ground against tens of thousands, right?" Regnild looks like he wants to agree, but he had grown wise to my MO in recent days, and seeing as I wasn't calling for a retreat, he chose to keep his mouth shut. "You will find that I can actually do that, Drazer." I smirk at him, the slight disdain in my voice, telling him exactly what I thought of the implied threat of his house fighting me for my power grab. Even if Gramps and myself were not present, the advantage of walls and better equipment, alongside the recently retrained Magi, would allow you all to hold the place until reinforcements arrived. Merrin scowls but offers a disgruntled nod anyway. "That is, if nothing went wrong." Almeril points out, "And in battle things always go wrong." "True," I nod along, my agreement genuine, which is why the two of us are here to pick up the slack. Savos offers a slow, mocking wave to all of them. The Redoran doesn't really take much convincing to agree to the honorable choice, so he nods and salutes. Virin looks hesitant, his eyes fixed to me as if he was attempting to decipher the truths of the universe through my existence. He fails naturally, and after an almost uncomfortable amount of soul-searching, he bows his head without a word. Right then, I clap my hands. Since your spines have yet to abandon you, how about we make an actual plan on burning the fuckers, yeah? Did somebody say burning? The maddened Telvanni jumps from her comfortable stone bed in one fluid movement, her eyes scanning us manically. And it seems consensus has been reached as well. I take her awakening in stride. So, Almeril, the state of the troops if you would. Being a nice guy, I summon seats for everyone else, toss Sina a scroll of restoration to play with, and begin the meeting for real. The dust cloud of the approaching army is unmistakable, tens of thousands of scaled feet striking the dry earth as one as they came to bring us our doom. Poor fuckers. It took them hours to set up camp, an hour I used wisely to unleash Scorch and Sina upon them, burning ladders, siege towers, and even a few of the ballistae by sending the near-suicidal elf and very suicidal bird on far too daring assaults, always having them retreat when things got too dangerous. That delayed them for a few hours more, the attack stopping only when Cinna once more ended up knocking herself out. That is, of course, until both Savos and I sent our familiars on their own, the constant firestorm already wearing on the attackers' morale. On the 12th aerial sortie, we felt a bubbling of magicka from within their camp, and in a flash of rich and vibrant green, the army was surrounded in a light anti-magic and anti-movement wards, most of them focused on countering air assaults. A bit shoddy in execution, Savos hums, still appreciable speed. We could crack it in minutes, I point out. He nods a few times. True, but it would reveal our power, something which you have invested great effort into hiding. Ah, to be read like a piece of parchment, I lament. Anyway, their siege weapons are closing in. The enemy lines, now covered by a boundary of rapidly and shoddily positioned stakes, shuffled, revealing dozens of wheeled mechanisms being pushed by teams of burly Argonians. Well, I try not to sigh, that is quite disappointing. Second era ballistae, I can't even... Savos doesn't even bother. Oh wait, I interrupt and grab his shoulder, pointing behind the lines. There come the catapults. Still shoddy as all hell, he mutters. Can't expect great woodworking from swamp folk. I shrug. They probably need to magically treat that shit, so it doesn't bend and warp too much. My lords, Merrin's voice reaches us, the dress elf far more clipped and deferent now that we were in a combat situation. The commander recommends stepping back. Artillery has been known to take overconfident magi from time to time. Instead of answering, I turn to Savos. How is your battle telekinesis, Gramps? He looks like he wants to wave the question away, but stops before waving his right hand in a vaguely so-so motion. It could be better if I am being honest. Then you better leave, I tell him. No need to risk things. And what about you? He immediately asks. I hum and begin tapping my foot, pulses of magicka following, but an instant later, oh, I am sure I will manage. General POV. Valazar, the great war chief of the Anzilial host, glared hatefully at the walls of the slavers' city, his fury barely contained by years upon years of training and discipline. War chief, one of his subordinates called, causing him to look down at the much smaller egg brother. The artillery is ready. Excellent. He allowed himself a moment's satisfaction. They may begin when ready. The officer bows and runs off. We should have waited for a greater muster, Grand Shaman Zelnara spoke in her usual cold, harsh tone. Young Iritza's warnings need not go unheeded. I did not ignore her, hissed Speaker. Valazar kept his annoyance from his tone, an utterly useless act before the old woman. Her information was taken and our plans adjusted. To flee would be to shame us all before our kin. Ah yes, the woman hisses disdainfully. Your tribes desire to see us all united, want to turn us in nothing more than the mirror of the Imperials as well. Do not test me, Valazar growls. She raises her hands in mock surrender. I would not dare. Unity is all that matters, Valazar goes on. Otherwise we will only end up slaves once more, once we are gone, and our descendants grow complacent and weak. Such is the cycle of life. The shaman shrugs uncaringly, but I see the time for words has passed. On that we agree. The great war chief huffs through his nose, Our success here will prove our truth, and Argonia will be as one." As he spoke, he clutched his massive hand, exactly as the first bolts and stones were launched at the walls. Dust rose, shamans tensed in preparation for retaliation, and they waited. Only for the dust to settle and reveal walls without even the barest of scratches. Valazar huffed in annoyance. "We really need to get some better designs." The shaman woman makes a non-committal noise, but doesn't say anything. The bombardment continues for 2 more hours, the artillery crew working as well-oiled machines, even if they were limited by their equipment's capabilities. But with each passing moment and each shot launched, Valazar felt his eyes narrowing further. The walls of Kagan Moore are not supposed to be thick enough to take this level of bombardment. He comments loudly enough, only for his closest counsel to hear. What their equipment lacked in stopping power, it made up for in sheer numbers, and he knew for certain they had 20 catapults and 40 ballistae on field, focusing on a single point of the wall. "Something is suspicious," he mutters before loudly ordering bombardment cease. It takes a good third of a minute to happen, but his orders are followed. The full minute passes, and the dust begins to settle, revealing the situation clearly for all to see. The walls of Kagan Moore looked battered on the outside, but at no point did they look ready to crumble under their own weight. And exactly above the area most targeted and facing the Argonian army stood a figure dressed in black. Glowing red eyes met the more mundane red of Valazar's glare as the armored figure atop the wall made an universal motion of challenge. "Come at me." Chapter 4, 125. Chapter 45, The Battle of Kagan Moore. Raven's point of view. I could practically taste the big lizard's hateful glare as he understood I invalidated his initial plan without taking a single step. I would begrudgingly admit his reaction to it was much more reasonable than I expected. The besieging army began shuffling about, their shock troops replacing their spearmen on the front as what remained of their rickety siege towers were pushed out before them, soon followed by numerous ladder teams. At least the ladders looked well made, would have made me feel bad for them otherwise. Within only a few minutes, the attackers were reorganized, and after one bellowing war cry, they began marching, their large, better armored forms screaming pure aggression even as they stepped carefully forward. A few of our magi, all of whom were stationed atop Kagan Moore's many tall towers, began launching bolts of lightning and fire to harass the enemy and start up their magicka regeneration as I taught them. Their attacks were met by the mages attached to the Argonian formations and mostly cancelled out, with only one group of some 100 attackers suffering heavy casualties as their mage fumbled his ward. At least so it went for the initial volley. Attrition would inevitably favour us in this case. The Argonian magi were far less useful once they entered missile range, though. Kagan Moore did not have many bowmen, a downright sad amount really, but it was equipped with a few hundred of automatons imported by the Redaran from yours truly, and those had already proven themselves by harassing the enemy into insanity mere days prior. Small, precise, and heavily armored, the little buggers could deliver a veritable deluge of high draw-weight crossbow bolts in a rate that could rival even my own white cloaks. Needless to say, they would reap a massive number of casualties, even if the lizard's formation barely looked shaken by the dozens of death they suffered each second. The small, giant-sized lizard leading their army proved himself not a complete idiot once more, as while the first wave of attackers, some 5,000 strong, marched at us from the south, thousands more began marching to the west and east, their desire to slowly envelop us quite evident for all to see. A bit premature, but I suppose I can deal with it, is all I had to say to that as I sent Scorch to inform the relevant people of the shift in tactics. General point of view. At first, Iril felt honoured and a bit relieved that his unit had been assigned to the most central wall, as that was where Lord Dagoth had chosen to make his stand. But as the very earth and walls shook beneath his feet, he felt his regret for his life choices growing by the moment. Only the reassuring grip of Grey's hand atop his shoulder managed to stop him from shaking like a coward. There were so bloody many of the lizards that he could not conceive the very idea of victory, much less imagine it as an actual outcome. And yet, an elf decades younger than even himself stood in front of him, staring down at the enemy not with defiance or hatred in his eyes, but boredom. Pure, disdainful boredom. The moment the enemy crossed some invisible threshold, the leader of the once accursed sixth house rose his hand, a staff that was not there a moment ago, now occupying the other, and brought it down with a deliberate slowness. In an instant, the very skies felt like they were set aflame, as massive storms of crackling crimson fire appeared to their flanks, devastating hundreds upon hundreds of the attacking army and herding the vast majority of them to the exact section of wall Irel was standing on. As Lord Dagoth confidently summoned a sword in his empty hand, his massive bodyguard yet unmoving, the young cobbler from Kagan Moore found that he most definitely regretted his life choices now. Lord Dagoth's expected deluge of magic did not stop the enemy from moving to strike the rest of the fortified city, an expected outcome to one Almeril Farin. The Redaran noble did not even look at the first Argonian that descended from the enemy siege tower as he beheaded him, his shield already slamming edge first into another lizard's neck. His fellow house members, and even the Dres he admitted silently, followed through immediately, slicing into the enemy with both skill and discipline. Those lizard men who did not get immediately cut down swiftly being brought down by bolts of fire and lightning from the nearby towers. The slaughter was efficient indeed, nearly perfect in fact. A quick count was called for, and only one Redaran warrior lay dead by the end of the first clash. As he stared at the ever-numerous enemy, Almeril found the kill-to-death ratio to be insufficient. Massanor of the Erebenimsun found that the more time he spent with these house elves, the more he was forced to respect them. For all his century of youth, he was taught that the great houses, leading most of Resdain, were corrupt and conniving, and yet as they fell around him, fighting as brothers, all he could do was respect their spirit and sacrifice. His shield protected as many as he could, his sword cutting down the Enwa invaders with each strike, and his heavy armor saved the priest's healing for all those who would truly need it. Masur stood above him as ever, his unreasonably tall brother crushing more than slicing the enemy apart with his glaive, giving more opportunity for the less experienced spearmen of Kagan Moore to cut down those less skilled and armored. As a lull came to the fight, mere seconds separating them from the next wave of lizards clambering up the ladders, Massanor felt a bit of validation for his decision to come here. At first he merely followed the priest and his brother. No Erebenimsun would truly ever be a believer in prophecy. But when Azura herself appears to tell you the time is night, you suck up your pride and follow through. That is just how it was done. He doubted the near child that was Lord Dagoth at first, but with each moment the young one proved to be beyond most, and likely all elves Massanor had ever met. The disdainful ease with which he made things happen, and the sheer audacity to stand before an army over 10 times the size of his own and preach victory was downright inspiring, even if the Ashlander would never admit it aloud. Was this the reason the gods chose him? The arrogance to stand before the world and tell it to go ash itself? Massanor supposed he would have to survive long enough to find the answer as the next wave came, and his blade tasted blood once more. The apprentice shamans of the Anzilil felt their blood boil as they held back the mere aftershocks of the storm of fire that had consumed their comrades. Wards broke, amulets were drained, and the very magicka within their bodies was repurposed to intensify the slaughter. As a champion warrior leaped from the siege tower, the sole remaining true shaman let out an internal cheer, hoping that the valiant egg brother could buy them a moment's distraction and let them reorganize. The enemy great shaman did not even bother looking at him as his guard slapped his head away, the firestorm growing ever more violent as if in retaliation. It was not long before far more than merely their blood began to boil. Savos's point of view. Kids these days are so damn demanding, I grumble cheerfully as the flanking force approaches. Oh, Gramps, go and hold an entire army back by yourself. Shouldn't be that difficult. I scoff before remembering I wasn't actually alone. Apologies. The Imperial legate just snorts and rolls his eyes. The Argonians finally step through the small patch of forest that was supposed to hide their approach from our lookouts, and I barely hold back an eye roll of my own. Whoever was leading them seems to notice that the walls facing them were mostly empty, and soon I feel the air start shaking even harder as they begin a frenzied charge, no doubt hoping to catch us by surprise. It was just too bad for them that I had days to prepare for this very event. Runes laid out all across the field between the Argonians, and the walls lit up. all of them flickering with power as a connection was established with Oblivion and the good Daedra. Raven may disdain their use, but as a conjurer, I found that I could now make contracts far more easily by mere association, why some Mephilans were even willing to fight for free. That is to say, the field was suddenly covered by a good 2,000 Dremora warriors, and even aided by prepared runes and enchanted artifacts gifted to me by my grandson. I felt myself nearly fall unconscious then and there. The legate whistled appreciatively, and a moment later the silence caused by the surprise summoning was broken as both sides began screaming at each other. The Dremora were not particularly creative with their taunts, but a massive demon, as Raven called them, screaming his lungs out at you while trying to brain, you did not really need much effort to be terrifying. Evidently, the lizards agreed, as their formations began buckling a mere minute after the clash began. Well, gentlemen, I stretch a bit and pop my neck, and ladies, I quickly add to the amusement of the few female legionaries, I do believe it is time for us to join in on the fun. The legate salutes and begins barking orders, the light cavalry under his command moving out with practiced ease as they prepared a flanking attack. I, on the other hand, would be much more direct in my own attack, I thought as I downed a perfect potion of magicka and summoned Brightburn at his full size, stepping atop him with practiced ease. We did not need to communicate verbally as he launched himself into the skies, an unstable mix of destructive magicka already swirling within my hand as I began disintegrating Argonians left and right. At least the soil will be richer when we were done. Both my familiar and I thought at the same time. General POV. Great Warchief Valazar kept his expression perfectly blank as he observed the battlefield. He knew the enemy was capable, but the mounting casualties were going even beyond his most radical expectations. Over 7,000 warriors across 3 different attack waves and dozens upon dozens of shamans fell to the enemy. Those kinds of numbers would humiliate anyone, doubly so the radical fool of the Anzilil, and thus ruin his ambitions. Great shaman, he called out, drawing the old woman's knowing gaze, we must strike out now. Very well. The "you foolish child" went unspoken, but most assuredly not unheard. Within minutes, his second had been informed of his duties, and his elite companions readied for their assault. Their rare orichalcum plate armor, enchanted to the brim so as to resist the most powerful of Telvanni sorcerers, long enough to deliver a killing blow. His preparation cost him another 500 warriors as an elder shaman finally fell to the concentrated fire of the slaver magi, his unit of archers following soon after as they were consumed by a barrage of fireballs. The enemy did not go unpunished, though, as 2 towers fell soon after, one shriveling up and falling apart under a powerful storm of snow, and the other falling apart under a barrage of artillery. The smug bastard leading the slavers could not be everywhere, and his protection required his focus to be perfect. A fact Valazar chose to abuse to its fullest. Already the walls were beginning to be worn by the barrage of artillery, his egg brothers instructed to target the few spots away from the ladder and siege tower teams, both distracting the defenders and potentially cutting off their reinforcements. A section of wall was nearly overrun as a part of it caved in, but the enemy magi barely managed to save it by burning down a siege tower. Still, the casualties would make any subsequent attack easier. His archers were also slowly beginning to do serious damage, even if it cost them dearly for each arrow loosed. Another blast of light came from the east as he rose his hammer and began his march. He could only lament the deaths caused by what was no doubt a massive trap, and hope that the western assault would have a better time of it. His rapid march soon broke into a sprint as he felt the very air around him heat up, the only thing stopping him from certain death by incineration being the hist speaker's own magics. The old woman glared up at the wall with narrowed eyes as her wards, her pride and joy as far as Valazar knew, were pushed back by blast after blast of powerful purple flame. He was no mage himself, but something told him the wards being set aflame somehow wasn't a good thing. That the hist speaker growled and drank a potion, but a moment later only served to confirm this. Valazar shook his petty concerns away and readied himself to climb up the bloody siege tower in front of him, though a small part of him wondered why it was not incinerated where it stood. Before he and his band could follow through with their plans, the ground suddenly shook with impact as the hissed speaker staggered back and redoubled her casting, a cloud of dust now covering the corpse-ridden siege tower. Valazar blinked, and the cloud was gone, revealing a figure more massive than even he. "Greetings, meatbag," it growled. "My master bid me to capture you, and I will not fail." In an instant that only he could follow and react to, Valazar found his hammer blocking a flaming ebony glaive from killing one of his companions, the force of the blow nearly doubling him over. He blinked as he realized one of his companions had gotten kicked in the chest while the enemy struck at him, his body breaking under the massive force and leaving but a smear on the ground. "Yes," the ogre chuckled darkly, "now there is a look I can appreciate." Valazar would never admit it, but a part of him rejoiced even as he and the creature began striking at each other with reckless abandon. Rarely was he ever able to find someone who could face him and not break. Great Shaman Zelnara, or Hist Speaker if you were of a more devout mentality, could only curse as she was forced back over and over by the beyond Archmage elf atop the wall. Her wards, trained within the now-defunct Mages Guild, were the greatest in all of Argonia, and the fact that she had to focus on them fully instead of being able to strike out from under their aegis told her just how utterly idiotic their decision to attack had truly been. The elf, the renowned and among her people quite dreaded, by sheer reputation and implication to any who had enough of a mind to think. Lord Dagoth threw so much magic at her within each second that she wondered where exactly he was pulling it from. Each spell was potent enough to drain a fully ordained shaman utterly, and yet the elf kept chaining them into more ridiculously complex and cursed forms, forcing the ancient woman to keep modifying her own wards lest the curses consume them utterly and redirect all of her magic against her own people. A small part of her wondered if the bastard was using her to experiment, but that thought was too ridiculous to actually consider. She finally caught a chink in the enemy spell, a small inefficiency that would never be noticed by less experienced eyes, and immediately took the chance to strike back, the curse upon her wards contained and redirected back to its master, only for the one currently fighting the war chief to kick him away in a sudden burst of speed and raise his hand, completely negating both the curse and spell at once. Zelnara had never seen any ward so utterly solid and knew immediately that the creature countering her was no mortal being. Valazar took the distraction as invitation to strike back at his enemy, his natural regeneration so utterly ridiculous by even the high standards of his people that he was able to heal his broken bones in a mere second. The massive metal creature blocked the attack, joined by odd shadowy creatures rising from beneath it, which warded off Valazar's cohort of warriors. Only centuries of experience saved Zelnara as she felt the air shift ever so slightly to her right and immediately displaced herself upon the earth, barely avoiding a decapitating swing of a single-bladed sword wreathed in grey flame. "Madam!" The crowned elf did not seem disappointed by his failure and instead offered a respectful but shallow bow. Zelnara felt a bit surreal about the whole thing, but still gave a nod of her own. Greetings exchanged, the two stared at each other for a brief instant before the entire area around them exploded with magic, an ancient grandmaster facing down a rising star of blinding brightness and swiftly finding herself pushed back. That she would manage to hold the elf at a stalemate for a full 5 minutes would earn her immense reputation among both friend and foe. Valazar grunted in annoyance as yet another one of his companions was crushed under the careless grip of what he belatedly realized was a hist-damned automaton. That the damn thing held emotion within its enchanted eyes baffled him, but he did not truly have much time to consider its implications as he kept exchanging blow after blow with it. The creature was powerful, this he could admit, but he was the apex of his species, blessed by both hist and lineage, and he would not fall to a mere minion, no matter how mighty. The Argonian giant hissed out a battle cry, his hammer finding the weak point in the automaton's glaive arm and cracking the crystalline metal, holding it together, even as one of his egg brothers was rent asunder to buy him the chance. Retaliation came immediately, and he felt his ribs cracking and his heart temporarily failing as he was thrown back dozens of meters, his own weight serving to make his hurtling form into a projectile that led to just as many deaths. He had won out in the exchange, of this he had no doubt. While the creature was powerful, it would not heal any time soon, and Valazar already felt his bones reconnecting, his feet already moving on their own as he ignored the pain and readied yet another powerful strike, only to feel the fingers holding his weapon crack as the automaton simply punched down with a closed fist, ripping the appendages apart with immense force and immediately following through with a powerful headbutt. Valazar snarled as he felt his snout breaking and bit down on a powerful healing salve given to him by the shamans, speeding up his healing to an even more ridiculous degree as he simply punched the metal beast, throwing it back much like it did to him. Their dignified battle soon turned into an outright brawl with metal cracking and bone breaking with each second that passed. And unluckily for the automaton, in a battle of attrition, Valazar could outlast a dragon. The great war chief roared in triumph as he rose his hammer and prepared to finish the thing off, only for his hand to fly away and his arm disintegrate in an instant as he instinctively leaned back. He felt a familiar magic tugging at his back and saw the ragged form of the shaman standing behind him, his eyes snapping to the enemy leader, but a moment later. He saw as the automaton stood up and calmly retreated up the siege tower, moving just as swiftly as he did during their battle, damage be damned. "Greetings, little farm tool," the one he was told was named Dagoth spoke. "How nice of you to finally show yourself after watering the ground with thousands of your own." He held back a snarl at the familiar slur. "Why do you talk?" he asked in ill-practiced Tamrielic. The masked elf tilted his head. "I suppose I am just curious. You remind me of a friend of mine, however vaguely." He tacked on with a fair bit of disgust. "Only you seem to be far less wise than he." Valazar scoffed. "Whatever games you play do not interest me. When I am done killing you, your friend will soon follow." "Is that so?" He could not see it, but he could definitely feel the elf raise an eyebrow. "I am sure dear old Shalazar will be quite disappointed by that." Hearing that name, Valazar's sight instantly went red, his regrown arm drawing a blade from his belt in concert with his hammer, his form blurring as he struck at the elf with newfound strength. Only the elf did not feel like playing fair at all. Each step Valazar took was followed by an explosion of a rune set below him. Each swing was returned with weapons enchanted to kill a god, and soon he felt himself weakening as even his regeneration reached its limits. The only thing that saved him from what he thought would be instant death was the interference of the great shaman, who threw all the power she could at his foe, and still left him to suffer grievously. And to make things even worse, the damnable elf had taken no damage whatsoever. "What use is having all that vitality?" The elf spoke with utter disdain in his voice. "If all you are going to do with it is bleed all over me." As if listening to him, all the blood covering his robes flowed away, leaving even his robes pristine. Valazar, for the first time in his life, felt utterly terrified by what he saw, which is why when Zelnara grabbed him by the shoulder and he felt himself being tugged back, he did not resist at all. Raven's point of view. Who just charges at a literal archmage and expects to survive? Fucking dumbass. I shake my head. Even if he practically confirmed he had some kind of connection to Shalazar, I was half tempted to remove him so that the great lizard wizard would not be forced to face the disappointment. The two of them fell back, and I allowed it. I wasn't quite so retarded as to charge after them, as even if I could theoretically win on my own, being surrounded left far too many variables for my paranoid ass. That and one did not grow nearly as much in political power by butchering thousands as he did in leading others to do the same. A big shame I did not have a force to strike back at them while they were demoralized too. Feeling a light buzzing in my passive clairvoyance, I looked to the east and felt a grin spreading on my face. General POV. As horns began sounding out all across the battlefield, and the enemy began an ordered mass retreat, wherever they could, that is, Iril felt his exhausted hands falling to his sides and his tired grip slackening. He still held on to his spear, though Lord Farron taught them to never lose their weapon, whether they had a sidearm or not. Once Lord Dagoth decided he would face a portion of the enemy army alone, Iril and his force were redirected to the western flank where the rest of the militia was stationed. The fighting atop that particular wall was the bloodiest, and only the flanking charge of Iril's brothers in arms, and the flames summoned forth by the Lady Carvani, allowed them to push the enemy back long enough for the lines to stabilize. The Redaran needed no such help, of course, as they butchered anything and anyone appearing on the eastern flank with the skill of bloodied centuries. Their losses were reportedly low, but Iril was understandably not high up on the priority list when it came to sharing information. The young cobbler grunted as he felt his rear hit the dead body of an Argonian, his tired lungs breathing greedily of the filthy air around him. It took him a few moments to calm himself down, and all around him those who yet held the energy cheered at their enemies retreating back. He felt his eyes moisten as the realization that he would survive yet another day finally began setting in, and he turned to find Grey and share in his happiness, only to see the old veteran laying face down atop the wall, his saber buried deep in a massive Argonian's throat, neither he nor the animal breathing any longer. The moisture around Iril's eyes was no longer one caused by relief. Valazar glared in each direction as the hissed speaker dragged him back into camp. He still had the presence of mind to give out the command for an ordered retreat back to camp, but he could not do much beyond that. The elf's casual use of his distant ancestor's name was not something he could so easily settle over. How many? He found himself asking the great shaman who had convened a meeting of the war chiefs in his stead. She looked at him with both fury and disappointment. Over 19,000. He felt his heart stop due to sheer shock for a few seconds, his regeneration kicking in a moment later. Oh. He did not flinch as the clawed hand of the shaman struck his face, sending him sprawling back with a surprising amount of force. We will be pulling back to Andreis as soon as the wounded are ready to move. Zelnara told him in no uncertain terms. There we will see about our next moves and how to deal with the enemy reinforcements. Valazar sat up immediately, his eyes narrowed. Reinforcements? Our western flanking force was pushed back. She informed him tersely, but not by any force we were aware of. Instead, there was an entire army waiting for them. Only 400 returned from the 5,000 you sent there. A cynical part of Valazar was quite thankful at that moment that his was only an expeditionary force. He was not terribly enthusiastic about convincing more of his people to join the fight now, though. Chapter 4, 126. Chapter 46. Reinforcements galore. General POV. Merin Zadir of House Dress cursed his pride as he hobbled after the group of nobles and officers. Oh, it was most certainly satisfying to refuse healing for those in greater need. But when Dagoth snorted loudly and simply left, while shaking his head, he knew he only made a fool of himself. He still did not ask for healing, though. His pride could only take so many hits in one day, even if he had bolstered it mightily with the blood of Argonians. His pain inevitably ceased as they soon reached the western gatehouse, a place Lord Dagoth had called them all to. For some reason he refused to share. Lord Arryn seemed to be the only one truly relaxed with the situation, the venerable Mer keeping a constant knowing smirk on his face. They did not need to wait long to get their answers, as a cloud of dust approached the city under the setting sun, and soon from the western hills came hundreds upon hundreds of banners fluttering in the air. Triangular banners attached to halberds, coloured in black and purple, and bearing a now familiar crest. Rows upon rows of blackened steel armour, all of it bearing at least the smallest glow of enchantment placed upon it. Most of the marching elves had their faces covered in masks, either of simple plain design of carved with the visage of the saints of old, and to their front marched 100 elves in cloaks of white fur, all of them armed with sleek crossbows of an odd design. As the army of some 4,000 elves and uncountable automatons approached the city, Lord Dagoth rose his hands welcomingly, and the army stopped, saluting him as one, the sheer noise and synchronicity of which sent goosebumps down Merin's spine. His fidgeting did not go unnoticed, and soon the Indoril approached him and wordlessly began healing him, muttering some empty apology about no doubt missing him within all the chaos, which only made the Dres even more embarrassed. Was the Indoril coward doing it all on purpose? Deciding to distract himself from his frustration, Merin Zadir looked down at the approaching force and pondered at just how far the Dagoth would reach before someone finally told him to fuck off, and just how many would die before they realized how useless defiance truly was. Raven's point of view. No one really complained as I commanded the army to march inside the city, well excepting Almeril, who bluntly told me his rivals would not hesitate to humiliate him for letting what was largely considered a foreign army into a city under his command, and then just as bluntly added that he did not care in the slightest. There was being dedicated to one's duty, and then there was whatever the fuck the Redaran did. Even as the rest of them whispered amongst themselves, Regnhild directing me a distinctly unsurprised look all the while, I still remained standing atop the gatehouse and waited patiently. Not that I had to wait long, as mere moments later my unnaturally sharp hearing caught the slightest shuffle of boots on stone. Well, I caught it after the numerous enchantments carved by my own hand did, but no one needed to know that little detail. As if on a casual stroll, a figure in immaculate light armor bearing my house colors simply walked up the walls, startling the absolute shit out of most of the nobles around me, but ignoring them completely in favor of offering me a lazy salute. "Boss." "Davos," I grin at him. "Took your sweet time, didn't you?" His face was covered by his helmet, but I could hear him internally screaming out, "Didn't you tell us to wait for the most dramatic moment to appear?" He held it back, of course, and instead bowed. "Met some lizards on the way, had to wade through their corpses to get here." Understandable. I pretended to ponder forgiveness, drawing a mildly confused look from Almeril before he realized what was going on and shook his head. Davos, apparently having had enough, snorts and turns to said Redaran, "Still kicking Farron?" "My lords are demanding, but the work is honorable and rewarding." Almeril answers with a light smirk. "I hope your own tasks have not been too draining on you." Did the two strike up a friendship while I was not looking? I raise an eyebrow. Then again, I was rather busy during those particular celebrations. "Hey, it could be worse." Davos directs a quick, cautious glance to the rest of them. "No offense meant, but didn't you all just go through an assault?" "That we did." Almeril nods. "We can share introductions and catch up later. The city still needs immediate work done, and I trust your hands are as willing as they are many." "Brought half a legion of automatons, so you don't have to worry about repairs." Davos shrugs. "The troops will be busy making themselves comfortable, though." "Keep the marksmen ready for battle for now." I interject. "Oh, and have the healers help those I missed. I didn't train the lot of them for nothing." And oh boy, was the Telvanni looking jealous as I mentioned that. Davos nods, and soon we were dispersing, everyone throwing themselves at work, rescuing those covered in debris, healing the wounded, looting and burning the dead, and counting our own fallen. By the end of the day, the numbers were confirmed, and we had lost some 164 actual soldiers and 870 militiamen, joined by 7 magi, only one of whom was an actual Redaran, while the rest came from the conscripts. All in all, a great success, even if some turned dour at losing a full third of our force. Now how does one persuade them to follow me in a counterattack? The answer was blatantly clear to me in a near instant, and by the time I came to the decision, my new staff was already in my hand. I would still keep to my choice of not doing every single thing on my own, but no one said I could not make things just a bit easier on my people, right? They needed to be convinced to follow me to oblivion itself, and while I could do so through religion and rhetoric, that just wasn't my preferred way of doing things. No, I was no born leader, even if I developed the skill over time. What I was incredibly powerful, unreasonably so in fact, and so I would convince them by showing that they would always be safe by my side, for my enemies would burn. Besides, what is a few more thousand deaths on my soul? General POV. Great Shaman Zelnara worked with clinical detachment as she guided her apprentices in stabilizing those still heavily injured, even hours after the fact the lack of medical supplies left behind at Andrethis in a rush and the general decimation of the shamans meant that not everyone could be saved. It was a good thing she set up the battle ward, or she was certain the birds would have returned by now. She fought the urge to curse at herself as she looked up and saw horror, a massive, incalculably complex circle filled to the brim with rune upon rune, stacked atop each other, layered atop each other. Some of the languages she knew, some she could recognize, but one she had never even seen or heard of before. She did not have much more time to ponder things as she felt the magicka above her begin to sizzle under some unknown power, and the once purple circle of runes was set aflame in cold, harsh grey, the ensuing silence lasting only for an instant before the spell was activated and what felt like the hammer of the foreign gods themselves fell upon their camp. Her battle ward held for 10 seconds. The one she threw up in a panic held for 5. The one attached to her necklace, made for such emergencies, held for 3. Her final layer of defenses managed to hold, taking every single remaining wisp of her magicka as she did her best to protect at least the large medical tent she was stationed in. She did not truly know if she had succeeded until her consciousness returned to her. Raven's point of view. As I lower my hand with a deliberate slowness, I hear Scorch whistle from my shoulder. "Geneva suggestions, am I right?" I let out a snort. "Oh, please, I didn't even make it self-replicating." For whatever reason, Savos began to cough uncomfortably. Did he eat something bad? Ignoring the Gawkers, I turned to Legate furious. "Legate, I feel like letting the enemy reorganize after that would be a disservice. Kindly harass them until they return to their own lines." I looked to Davos. "Send the marksmen with him, they should be able to keep up." The Legate grins and salutes, already marching away, while Davos doesn't even bother moving. My orders were already being relayed by one of the nearby agents, none of whom had shown themselves to my allies. Quite satisfied with the results, I summoned a bottle of mead and took a sip. Killing a third of the remaining enemy army was thirsty work indeed. It was very lucky for my psyche that Argonians were so easy to dissociate from. How many have I killed so far? 10,000? 15? It doesn't matter because by the end of all this, I would kill far, far more. I shook the dark thoughts away and looked to the gathered representatives of the great houses. We rest for 2 days, and then we strike back. No one said a single word in protest. A day later, I found myself standing atop the northeastern walls of Kagan Moore, staring off into the distance as Davos finished giving me his report on the progress of Silrune Fell. Anondor leaning back against a nearby tower entrance in silent vigil all the while. "So the giants have been pacified fully?" I ponder aloud, lightly scratching at my chin as I did. Maybe I should see about enhancing them somehow. Always good to have some extra help. Apparently the constant dragon visits unnerved them, and they were getting uppity. Good thing Crine didn't need to bother with them. Davos visibly suppressed a shiver at the thought. "Not like I can stop you if I wanted to, boss." He shakes his head. "Anyway, yeah, once your companion friend calmed them down again, we could expand into the valley itself." Most of the tradesmen remained in the city proper, but the farmers were getting annoyed they had to walk down the entire wall just to reach their fields, so Carsus decided the change was necessary. He did send something to that effect while I was still in Cyrodiil. I nod along. Not like our defenses there serve any true purpose anymore anyway. Reaching it by conventional means would be a nightmare. True enough. Davos shrugs. Haven't had a proper degenerate Falmer attack for weeks before I left, so things should be mostly safe. He pauses, still sent parties into the tunnels, just in case though. Probably wise, I hum. Any more interesting happenings? Beyond some idiots trying and failing to establish a poor man's dark brotherhood? No. He shakes his head. My eyes narrow instantly. That was fast. Davos's relaxed expression shifts and he sighs. "Boss, what happened exactly?" "Managed to cull the last members of that order and used their Night Mother as fuel." I answer bluntly to his immediate and unsurprised nod. I am not sure if the Void is already trying to get its hands on new tools or we are dealing with fans. Definitely the fans, he snorts. The lot of them were so incompetent I almost felt bad for cutting them down to the last. "Weep not for the stupid, you'll be crying all day," I drawl in response. We both share a snort and shake our heads, effectively ending the conversation until I spoke again about a minute later. "How is the wife and kid by the by?" Davos contains a smile. "Things are going pretty well. Little bugger is far too energetic, but Nightshade has him under control." I just snort. Just wait till he begins walking. That is where the true fun begins. He doesn't even bother questioning the words and simply nods. Ah, he has ascended beyond being baffled by me. How sad. A few hours later, the true reason behind my choice in venue was made apparent. As in the distance, the sound of marching boots could be heard, and another tall cloud of dust was thrown up by yet another small army making its way to Kagan Moore. Their march was far less synchronized than that of my own troops, making me feel incredibly smug about myself. What made me feel even more superior and slightly disappointed, if I was being completely honest, was the numbers and equipment of the forces approaching the city. Even if I knew this was only the initial relief force and the actual armies would follow a few days later. Sure, there were an extra 4,000 of them, but only 2 of those 4 were actual Redaran professionals. Another 1,000 looked to be the force sent by House Drez, clad in medium chitin-based armor and armed with spears and shields and of seemingly middling discipline. The final 1,000 did make me raise an eyebrow, though. The Telvanni obviously sent the least number of people, but also the most individually powerful of the lot, as I could easily count some 50 battle mages of varying skill, accompanied by 200 or so well-equipped bodyguards. The Sadras sent what looked to be every mercenary they could get their grubby little hands on, the lot of them being the most diverse of the whole group, and armored in anything between a mage's robe to full-plate orichalcum in the case of a couple of them. And finally, the most surprising group of all, just over 200 Indoril warriors, robed plate armor, saintly visages carved upon entire helmets, and mohawk plumes galore. This particular group seemed even more battle-ready and disciplined than the Redaran. Curious and Curiosa. Chapter 4, 127. Chapter 47, Greeting Notables and Cleaning Undesirables. We met them at the gates, the house nobles under my nominal command, marching a step or two behind me as I confidently stepped before a force of thousands of elves, with only less than a dozen by my side. "Hail!" a voice called from the army. "It is good to see you yet live, Lord Farron." Almeril answered with a simple, "You know I am hard to kill, Savin." "That you are, my lord." A relatively youthful warrior steps out from the group of Redaran guard, soon followed by what I guessed were the representatives of the other houses. The 2 Redaran elves share a quick nod before the younger one turns to me, a slight hesitance in his tone. "Lord Dagoth, I presume." "You presume correctly." I drawl with just a tinge of artificial empowerment in my voice. "A bit late to the party, but still, I can make use of you all." He keeps his somewhat jolly expression, but I can feel his impulse to frown. "So it is true, then. You have taken command over the city." "Only temporarily, I assure you." I wave his concerns away. "I have no designs on rightful Redaran land, but I also have no patience for being told no while good Dunmary lives are on the line." He does frown now, and someone as young as yourself, no disrespect meant of course, would know better than a veteran of many conflicts in how to lead Myr into battle. "Calm yourself, Savin," Almeril interjects in a perfectly neutral tone. "Had I a need of you to defend my honor, I would have informed you of it. Lord Dagoth may be young, but he has shown both wit and experience. Or did you forget those reports from Skyrim I had you read?" He looks like he wants to protest, but under the stare of his superior, he backs down. "Of course, my lord. My apologies for the presumption." "Apology accepted," Almeril answers flatly. "And I assure you, had it not been for Lord Dagoth, the city would have fallen 3 times over. As should be expected of one rumored to be an archmage before 20. An old, gravely voice, fit more for a man's deathbed than actual conversation, interjects, and a short, weathered elf steps forward, garbed in imposing Telvanni robes that honestly made him look even smaller. "Master Vels Carvani." He ever so slightly bobs his head. "I trust it is you I have to thank for my fool daughter not killing herself yet." Said daughter ignored him utterly, fiddling with something under her robes and looking anywhere but at her father. I offer him a commiserating look. "She certainly tried." He snorts loudly. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Sina, who was obviously pretending to ignore the conversation, reddened but still refused to meet his eyes. "I trust that you plan on dealing with the animals promptly." The Telvanni master shakes his head at his daughter one last time, grumbles something about a waste of good favors, and turns back to me. "I did not march ahead of the army for nothing, I hope?" "We plan to march out a day hence," I answer easily enough. "Speaking of the army, however, would you kindly tell me of its composition?" "Let the child deal with it." The master snorts once more, drawing an immediate sputter from the Redaran leader beside him. "What I am wondering is why I should subordinate myself to you and not take charge on my own." "Ah, I pretend to just realize what he was getting at. Well, you see, it is rather simple. And before he can get another word in, I slam the entire area around me with my presence, making the entire army before me flinch back a step. I am far beyond your ability to do so. I finish. The Telvanni, however, only grinned at me widely, his long, sharp and narrow teeth, no doubt deformed by some ritual on full display. I noticed a bit of sweat going down the side of his head, but he still kept grinning as he spoke. Consider my complaints withdrawn. But of course, I smile back at him beatifically, now are there any other notables waiting to present themselves? It took a bit for them all to compose themselves, but we got things rolling quickly enough. The Sadras and Dres representatives were both distinctly unimpressive. The Dres offered apologies for the lack of numbers they sent, but he made the understandable point of their lands being threatened by a possible incursion as well. He was of the same rank as Merrin and split the forces between the two of them before telling Almiril to organize them as he willed. The Sadras was a fat old merchant-looking fellow who gave one look at Regnild and promptly tossed all the responsibility on him. The Sadras, who had slowly been winning my respect, did whisper about it on first opportunity. Help me take full credit for everything, and you will have an ally in me. I made a quiet noise of agreement, but did not react visibly. I could see the in-house politics being played before me, and if some fat piece of lard wanted to rise on the efforts of someone I had seen fight and nearly die, even while complaining about it, I would always support the actual fighter. The offer of alliance also helped, of course, doubly so if he raised in rank after this. And last but most certainly not least, a figure bearing the same heavy armor as the rest of the Indoril silently walked up to the younger Redoran, eyes fixed at me with an almost burning intensity. Virin seemed to be quite worried at the figure's presence, but deigned not to say anything just yet. While the man continues posturing, I take a moment to note his oddly flame-shaped sword. It wasn't anything mind-bogglingly powerful, but the design was unusual enough to merit mention. Seemingly noticing my growing disinterest with his person, the Indoril finally spoke, spawn of the Sharmat. My oh so very distant cousin, I fired back instantly, the wording of which drawing immediate looks of shock and confusion. The two other Indoril warriors who had followed him share a quick look, practically radiating surprise and a mild sense of panic. Veyrin, on the other hand, nodded to himself in validation. The yet unnamed Indoril narrows his eyes behind his masked helmet. I share no kinship with you. Remove your helmet, I wave him off. You've wasted enough of my time already. He tries to protest for a bit, but quickly realizes he had drawn far too much attention already, and sighs, slowly lifting the visage of Nerevar from his head and revealing bright golden eyes and skin almost too pale to belong to a Dunmer. The surprisingly young elf, going by his rather powerful voice at least, offers me an annoyed glare. Happy? We are all both children of stolen divinity. Why pretend otherwise? I ask in a bored tone, your poor attempts at subterfuge aside, I was told your house would probably not show themselves. How come you are here? He scowls now. Our venerable grand descendant. Every word was laced with waves of bitterness. Was quite open in telling everyone willing to hear that he had no interest in helping the rest of Morrowind fight for itself. My comrades, and felt no need to follow such treason. Respectable. I offer the slightest nod, surprising him quite a bit. I am guessing that unlike the rest of them, these are all the forces you've brought. The descendant of Almalexia nods. Hold on. Merindres interjects, pointing a finger at the Indoril. Are we truly going to allow this thing to fight with us? Ever so slowly I turn to look at him. Do you see me giving a single shit about his ancestry, Dresi? He looks at me with confusion. Well, no, but nothing. I shut him up. If he wants to bleed for his people, neither you nor anyone else is to stop him. It is that simple. A few grumble, but none truly protest after that. The Indoril also gives me a genuinely baffled look, but soon shakes his head. I have been remiss. I know your name, but you do not know my own. He offers a practiced aristocratic bow. Indoril Alandro, at your service. Happy to have you. I offer the platitude as easily as breathing and refocus on the real issue. But we are getting off track. The Indoril detachment is understandably undermanned. What of the others? That goes for the Sadras detachment as well, I am afraid. They are too far to offer direct support quickly enough. The young Redaran officer interjects, only houses Dres and Redaran were able to send any real force, and 16,000 elves are marching south after the initial muster. I can't help but chuckle at this. We call for a third of Morrowind, and a mere expeditionary force still outnumbers us. I outright snort as I put it to words, gods that is fucked. Some prisoners were taken, and a picture of the Argonian effort was slowly being made. The little shits were pretty resistant to interrogation, but we managed to confirm that the army that attacked Kagan Moore was basically an advanced strike force meant to gauge our reactions and gather information in the most aggressive manner possible. Foolish, but who was I to deny my enemy their mistakes? While the rest offer words of agreement, the Telvanni simply huffs, as if 100 of those animals could even be compared to a single Dunmer in value. Valuable or not, Alandro cuts him off. They still possess the ability to fight us. Fight you maybe, the Telvanni raises his nose at him. Having enough of the posturing, I cut in. Now that we have established our situation, I do believe you should all take a rest. We must march hard tomorrow if we are to strike the enemy efficiently. Some more platitudes were shared, and soon the newly arrived army was marching into Kagan Moore. When they noticed that forces loyal to me, and the militia was most assuredly more loyal to me than it was to the Redaran, outnumbered all of them, none questioned my right to lead again. That the professional legion of House Dagoth, standing in perfectly spaced parade, rest to their sides as they marched in, probably helped as well. The meeting that night was long and exhaustive, and it was decided that only the militia and mercenaries from Cyrodiil would be left to protect the city, while everyone else would move out to simply overwhelm the enemy as quickly as possible. I spent a while scrying at them and concluded that simply blowing our way through was more than feasible. The objective I chose being incredibly simple: retake Andreis, refortify the place, and try and find any enemy plans to use as proof. Of course, the existence of said plans was the main reason for the plan in the first place, which was an opportunity I would be an idiot to miss. Alandro Indaril found me later in the night, accompanied by Viren, who seemed conflicted about something. We spent hours discussing the false tribunal and their betrayal, and the reasoning behind me, calling him a distant cousin. My utterly secular view of things was oddly soothing to the both of them, and they left with no conflict between them and a promise of support for me. Imagine being able to garner favors by just not being a dick. The Cyrodiilics would go wild at the concept. Vels Carvani also made sure to visit me later, subtly thanking me for his daughter's safety now that he could actually show it. The Telvanni were all about personal strength and power, and the vast majority of them had to invest immense effort into maintaining their veneer of unflappability, lest their rivals abuse it, which inevitably caused a rather toxic feeling of detachment from their children, for they would only be perceived as yet another weakness. Only monstrosities like Devaith Fear could truly afford not to give a singular shit about theirest of their house. People like Vels, though, well, they had to fight for every scrap, or so was my conclusion after sharing a few words with the man and reading his emotions like an open book. We marched out in the morning, our multi-origin army somehow acting with enough coherence as to not slow us down while we followed the road south. The Argonians left some traps and obstacles, numerous obstacles actually, along said road, but with the presence of 3 archmagi and a few masters, those did not slow us down one whit, as we could simply fling the trees and rocks away. Half a day later, after a particularly scorching day of walking, we came upon the walls of Andreis. The border fortress that was once a market town was almost completely demolished, save for its walls and towers. It had 3 layers of protection that faced south, composed of a moat and a double wall, but the one facing north was left far weaker, left as both bait and open ground for the artillery and archers upon the walls to reap a heavy toll for anyone looking to exploit the seemingly weaker flank. That, and it also made reconquering the place far easier if someone came full force from the north. The Redaran knew their shit, even if I'd have still fortified the entire place to hell and back just in case. There is no need to reconquer a place if it never falls in the first place. Then again, I had more money than I could reasonably spend in my lifetime, so my perspective may have been just a teeny bit skewed. Speaking of skewed, they certainly booked it faster than I expected. I mutter as I observe the distant walls. Bah, Vels Carvani scoffs. An animal knows when to run and hide at least. As much as I fear being the voice of reason, Alandro Indaril interjects, there are still over 10,000 lizards in that fortress. 10,000 corpses as far as I am concerned. Almiril looks at the grave of thousands of his fellows with barely contained hatred in his eyes. Quite, I nod. Best be done with them as quickly as possible then. As orders began to flow out from our makeshift base camp, courtesy of Gramps and yours truly, an air of excitement seemed to overtake the army. Scouts were sent out and targets chosen, and a mere 2 hours after we arrived, we were ready. The battle began with our magi, myself and the other most powerful ones included, bombarding the ever-loving shit out of the walls. A similar if more structured ward appeared above the fortress, no doubt made by that same Argonian archmage I fought mere days earlier, but even if it was better rooted into the ground, it lacked the direct support of its creator. The bubble above Andreis cracked within a minute, and its walls followed suit in seconds. The first wave had already reached it by that time, the small force of Indaril warriors, now joined by Veyran and his Ashlander followers, smashed into the disorganized and disorientated defenders like a hammer into glass. Their armor was far stronger than it seemed initially, and they were more than capable of holding the breach open long enough for the Redoran to follow after them and into the main concentration of the enemy around the keep. Alandro, revealing himself as an expert fire mage with rather well put-together firewalls, also helped with their advance. They would have still been drawn into a stalemate, though, if not for my own soldiers climbing up the remaining and now clear walls with ropes, hooks and spikes, the marksmen and the automatons immediately turning every single living Argonian in sight into pincushions with their ridiculous rate of fire. I may or may not have received many a deathly envious look as my fellow nobles realized the effectiveness of those repeaters, and days later I'd keep getting visits from the different representatives looking to get their hands on a supply. The moment I quoted them the price for the enchantments, though, they found one reason or another to be content with their old reliable. The combined force of Telvanni and Sadras were maneuvered to the other end of Andreis, their magi tasked with allowing their comrades to ascend the double walls rapidly. They announced their success in their mission by Vels Carvani levitating himself above the wall and telekinetically grabbing onto a crumbling tower and smashing it into the fortress keep from the south. The Argonians were beginning to crumble, and as the Dres began streaming through the many wall breaches, I decided it was my time to act. Openly summoning my wings, I flew into the sky before descending into any area that proved capable of offering more than the barest resistance. They fell to my sword and dagger like wheat to a scythe, officers and what passed for their magi falling left and right as I scried their positions while their subordinates were soon to follow, cut and broken by a freshly repaired and rather frustrated Akulakan. Anondor also followed from a top scorch, and the two soon proved themselves a deadly pair. The dreaded Birdman burning entire units on his own, while the Snow Elf Paladin cut down anyone stupid enough not to flee as quick as their lizardly little legs allowed them. So well did the two work together that Scorch even made a point of being disdainful to him, only sometimes instead of all of the time. Some losses were still inevitable by the time the last resistance crumbled, but as we counted the dead, none found it fitting to complain. The entire garrison had been cleared out, and hundreds of prisoners taken at the low cost of just over 200 elven lives. And when Davos returned from his task, and I announced to my fellow leaders of our discovery of the enemy plans to invade full stop in a few months, it was unilaterally decided that the sacrifice was well worth the reward. Once the excitement and honestly fear for most of them died down, we fell upon the task of ensuring the position from any further attacks and planning our next steps. Most of the army would be left here to protect against counterattacks, while some of the Redoran and Dres troops would return north to be stationed elsewhere. As for the rest of us, well, my own task would be to politic the entire kingdom into a state where it could weather the oncoming storm. Easy, right? Still, before any of that, the fortress needed repairs, and guess who showed off being able to transmute stone with disdainful ease? Our return north some 4 days later was greeted with the sight of an entire army camp, now surrounding Kagan Moore. The banner of the Redaran stood prominently above a large tent in the middle of it all, and the moment the force accompanying me came into sight, a messenger greeted me with a polite invitation to meet with the Archmaster. Time to face the music and set an entirely new tune. Chapter 4, 128, Chapter 48, The House of the Warrior. My mount's assured trot did not slow down, even as my entourage tensed. The nobles and their guards that accompanied me as we sped ahead of the rest of the returning army, all understanding the sudden and almost tangible gravity of the situation. Admittedly, one does not need a great political mind to understand that being stared down by over 10,000 professional Dunmeri troops is a situation with gravitas. Even Almiril looked ready for the dressing down of his life. "You sure we should just be walking in there, boss?" Davos asks from atop a horse of his own. He did not sound actually worried, merely discomforted. Keeping my eyes forward, I shrug. A bit late for that question, no? His expression remains cautious under his helmet. Just feeling exposed in front of an entire army is all. Well, you have to get used to it at some point. I turn to him with a grin. Besides, you know damn well they aren't stupid enough to try anything. Davos's eyes practically shout their doubt, but he has enough trust in me to settle on a simple, "I've seen more than my share of stupid nobles, but I guess the Redaran are fine." Almiril, who had ridden up closer to us atop his guar, offers a barely audible chuckle as he hears Davos's final words, "Shining praise from you, Lord Davos." He looks up at me and hesitates for only a moment before speaking, "A word of advice, if you will." I subtly wave for him to go on. "The Archmaster, he is obligated to question you." He says gravely, "Do not falter in your choices, not even for a moment." One of those fabled tests of character, then. I raise an amused brow at this. I never do, Almiril. Most of all where it can be seen. He speaks no further and merely nods in satisfaction. General POV. Lord Varan Sarano waited patiently before his grand tent, the impractically massive edifice having taken near a third of a day to set up even with practiced hands, and once more reminding him of the prison that leadership was. He still kept up appearances, though. Some people's respect was won too easily by ostentation and wealth, and his house was filled with as many elves of wisdom as it was with those of prowess. He shook his head at the useless thoughts assailing his mind in boredom, and focused his eyes forward, noticing a group of some 24 mounted Dunmer, most of them bearing some level of authority in their very posture, and none so much as the figure in the lead, astride a downright massive Skyrim-bred warhorse and clad in artifacts from head to toe. His soldiers knew better than to accost the incoming group, so they all simply stood there and waited for the small party to approach, giving Varan more than ample time to go over the reports of each and every person he could recognize. He would not admit it aloud, but he was privately rather impressed with the collection of elves a mere call to arms had managed to gather. The group soon approached, and Varan's eyes met that of the young Dagoth, but before he could attempt to gauge his purpose in any way, the younger elf chose to dismount, moving far quicker and with fluidity vastly above what one might expect from a mage. So the tales weren't all garshit. One of his older councilwomen grouched, the ancient woman the only person yet seated, as she could not stand for long periods of time without tiring. He found it hard to disagree, as his eyes met a pair of burning embers that made him feel smaller than he knew himself to be. Raven's point of view. I did not say anything as the rest of the people behind me dismounted, our horses and gars being politely taken by some of the Redaran attendants present. Some might be worried about this, but frankly even the current prime house would face a shit show of epic proportions if they tried anything. Instead, I focused on my host, and what a host he was. Tall, broad-shouldered for a Dunmer, and covered in so many scars that it went from making him look manly to straight-up looking mildly disfigured. He wore medium armor, emblazoned with the Redaran scarab and made of the best materials in such a way to provide the greatest protection while not limiting movement. The single long blade hanging off his left hip, radiating enough focused power to impress even me. In fact, surrounded by what I presumed were his counselors, he could probably hold his own in the case of a fight between us and even potentially push me back. He'd never win, though, since I could just, fuck off whenever I wanted, but he could put up a fight. But that was enough of that, Lord Redaran. I greet him politely after the silence went from tense to just plain annoying. I must admit, I find myself rather impressed by your response time. Lord Dagoth. He nods back, neither of us even contemplating the barest inclination of the head towards each other, let alone a bow. Our failure to react to the invasion in time brings shame to all of us, even if our garrisons should have been prepared for such eventualities. He spoke in a firm and powerful voice, even as his tone remained paradoxically calm and quiet. These are hard times. I offer the simple platitude, though I trust you don't expect us all to stand around in the sun all day. We did ride quite hard to make good time here. Vels Carvani, who looked just about ready to demand the same, deflated slightly behind me. Of course, Lord Redaran nods. You are more than welcome to join us for a meal, and then we may discuss recent events. He pauses, gives me a once-over, and those that may yet follow. Some half an hour and a light meal later, we found ourselves contentedly seated within Redaran's massive tent. The thing was big enough to hold a full war room and reception area while warded to hell and back against any cheeky mage who tried to set it and everyone inside on fire. Varan Serrano spoke first, Lord Dagoth. He was still forced to look up at me slightly, even as we sat. Your presence, while expected, seems awfully well-timed. Some of my counsellors go so far as to presume some form of collusion, even if I find the very idea ridiculous. Said counsellors can speak up right now and get their due for making accusations like that. I immediately respond with a fair bit of menace in my voice, both artificial and not, though I do not promise to return them intact. One of the younger elves at Sarano's side barely contained a shiver of terror, but I pretended not to notice, even as I noted their information down for later. Yes, a rather ridiculous proposition. The Archmaster agrees dryly, a tinge of disappointment in his tone. Intentional or not, you have done House Redaran and Morrowind itself a great favour. One that should be expected of the lord of a great house, but that is not an opinion shared by most. He does not quite look at the representatives of the other houses, but I do feel his attention moving to them, especially the Indoril. Alandro, of course, felt indignant by all of it, but kept his mouth shut. Some people just don't like doing their jobs properly. I simply shrug. I have neither the time nor the inclination to bother with them. A sentiment I am sad to say I share, Redaran agrees, though if you would indulge me, your timing does seem a bit too convenient. He looked genuinely curious, likely attempting to further gauge my motivations. I was actually running late, if you would believe it, I point out vaguely. Late? Serrano raises one bemused brow. Reports tell me your timing was eerily perfect. Feeling just a bit annoyed by the continued focus on this particular detail, I shrug. That was probably just Boethia finding it funny. Immediately, a good number of the councillors narrowed their eyes, their blessings from said Daedra, minor or otherwise, evident for all with the eyes to see. And then they did absolutely nothing, as they found not even the slightest reaction from said connection, the apparent irreverence going completely ignored by their patron. I see. Serrano breaks the silence once again, his own blessing actually reacting, but probably not in a way he expected. And what of your usurpation of command? He was probably asking me more for his counsel than himself. A representative of sufficient rank was present to lead the defences, and yet you found it fitting to take command of another house's number. Almaril clears his throat, drawing all eyes to himself. Yes, Brother Farron? Lord Redaran asks. If I may, my lord. He waits a moment and is not interrupted. Lord Dagoth did not demand to be given command of Kagan Moore's defence. I ceded it to him after my failure. I almost want to pat the madman on the back as pure pandemonium breaks out all around us. Every single Redaran beside the Archmaster immediately shouting over each other and throwing accusations at my poor boy. The situation did not amuse their master nearly as much as it did myself, and after some 15 seconds of incoherent yelling, he finally has enough. Silence. His tone was filled with something I could not quite identify yet. Yet another reason to visit Blacklight then. House Father Almaril Farron. Lord Redaran spoke with authority. Please explain to us your decision so that I am not further embarrassed by my own counsel. The different nobles accompanying me react with a mix of amusement and judgment. Though only Carvani openly snorts at all this, the Telvanni master looking ready to throw down if anyone called him out on it. Thankfully, or sadly I wasn't certain, no one did. Apologies for the vagueness, my lord. Faran bows. Your reports no doubt tell of how Lord Dagoth saved Kagan Moore, but they likely do not go into nearly enough detail to tell the truth of it. He pauses, giving himself a moment. The truth of the matter is, we had already lost when he arrived, and he crushed the attack by his lonesome in mere seconds. While this does merit even more respect for my fellow great lord, Serrano interjects, giving me an apprehensive look for a brief moment, that still does not explain why you gave up military command while yet on house soil. Because I had already failed. Almirall answers with some bitterness, and then in comes barely more than a mere child I saw charge into Aetherius itself with nary a moment's hesitation mere months prior, and crushes the foes that nearly brought me and mine low with an insult to the very concept of effort. Carvani chortles to my left. Almirall ignores him. Put simply, my lord, it was not I who came up with tactics to protect the city further, and it was not I who inspired 3,000 mer into taking up the spear, and then armed them with weapons and armor befitting of a proper army. I will have to inform the Archmaster it was Almirall who trained them, but I am not stupid enough to point it out now. So you found it dishonorable to hold on to command while someone of greater prowess and merit fought by your side. Another elderly Dunmer in Redoran colours interjects, the old Mer looking like some dapper cross between a scholar and a warrior. Yes. Almirall nods without hesitation. The Redoran councillors whisper between themselves, their words amusing me to no end, before the Archmaster spoke. Your choice is deemed the honourable one for the situation you found yourself in. No reprimand will be given, and your deeds, including those of your subordinates, will be added to your records. The seemingly unflappable Almirall visibly deflates at this, an immense tension leaving him under the approving looks of his superiors. Lord Redoran takes a few moments speaking to the other representatives here, greeting every single elf of note who took part in the defense and extracting just a bit more information from them by way of polite praise. He was quite skilled at that. Too skilled, in fact, as I realized another half hour had passed, and we were not a single step closer to actually discussing the big issue in front of us. Something I voiced quite clearly, once more drawing attention back to myself. But before even Varan could speak, an ancient croaking voice interjected, "Another attempt at challenging our authority, boy? Was occupying one of our cities not enough for you? Occupying it to great effect, might I add," I point out with a grin, might as well provoke someone looking to be provoked. "We are not discussing your efficiency here, child." The ancient woman that looked just about as dried up as the land she grew up in speaks up. "We are discussing your obvious grasping of power." Grasping of power, was it? I smirk at her, and do you see the three-eyed beetle hanging off those walls instead of the scarab? Don't play semantics with me, boy. All right, that voice is far too fucking annoying. With a blaze of gold, my magicka surges forward and into the old woman, the sheer volume of it doing wonders for her decaying form. Shouts are heard and swords clutched, but before anyone has the time to take a swing, my magic retreats, revealing a slightly younger-looking woman looking at me with wide eyes. I direct a look of pure boredom back. "Apologies, your croaking was growing irritating." She says nothing, even as Serrano gives her a look of concern. A bit miffed by their apparent audacity to question me so openly, I do not retract my magicka fully and instead allow it to gather around me, the regeneration making it seem like my presence grew with my annoyance at their stares. At one point it simply became too much to bear for all of them, and I spoke, "Allow me to make something abundantly clear." The air shimmered with my words as a few of the weaker elves present outright recoiled. I do not need to curry favor, I do not need to inspire, nor do I need to ask. Simply be happy that I choose to. The Telvanni representative and his daughter nodded along as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I do not wait for them to respond, as stunned as they were, and instead stand up and summon the enemy plans captured by Davos, throwing them atop the table and before the eyes of the stunned Mer. This attack was but the first wave of an invasion that still gathers within Argonian, held Deshan. Q gasps and wide eyes. I have neither the time nor inclination to waste another minute on this squabbling, and so by my authority as Great Lord of the Sixth House, as reinstated by the chosen Hortator Nerevar, I call for an emergency conclave of the great houses to be held as soon as possible. An entire minute passes in silence as the present leadership of House Redaran first calms themselves down and then exchange glances ranging from panic to stoic agreement. Finally, Varan Serrano looks back up to me and offers a simple nod. House Redaran has heard your call, Lord Dagoth. Chapter 4, 129. Chapter 49. Blacklight. The first thing that clued me in, we were near our destination, was the distant smell of the sea cutting through the constant ashy taste of the air. An hour later it was joined by the sound of waves endlessly flowing across the rocky coast, and finally the long mountain road was replaced by a vast coastal plain. I had not expected to return home so soon. Almeril mutters softly, or at all for that matter. Davos, who was riding just next to him, snorts, "You are a tough bastard, Farin. You would have survived just to spite them." The Redaran elf lets out a chuckle. "Your faith in me is inspiring." My own attention was far more focused on the sight before me as they bantered, though I did add a quick, "At least it is a place worth coming back to." Much to Almeril's pride, I even noticed Savos looking downright wistful as he looked down, but judging by the air surrounding him, I decided not to interrupt him with questions for the moment. The city of Blacklight dominated the landscape, its tall walls surprisingly pristine, covered from the ash storms as they were by the mountains to their south. The place was very large by Dunmer standards, the equivalent of Solitude if one slashed the population to a third, and far more ornate in its construction, as the architects tasked with expanding it were usually the trusted centurial masters of their craft. A massive harbour covered the entirety of the city's north, with dozens of ships of both Dunmerry and imperial design docking within at this very moment. I could practically hear the rowdy atmosphere from all the way here, literal kilometers away from the city. The rest of the current capital of Morrowind was neatly organized into districts, none of them looking particularly poor, while the area around the palace looked rather opulent, though in that rugged practical sense I've come to expect from the Redaran. And speaking of my hosts-to-be, while at first the ones travelling with me, including the Archmaster and a good chunk of the councillors that followed him south, kept their distance, they soon found themselves warming up to me as we spent our nights around campfires, talking of deeds performed and victories won. Once the challenges and spars started coming up, their cautious respect of my power swiftly turned into genuine respect for my prowess, even if I still mostly relied on my superior physique to defeat the true masters of melee. I never did face Serrano, though. Two great house leaders fighting in any way was too much of a shit show in the making for either of us to indulge in. We did partake in some rounds of that strategy game Minathra got me, and as one might expect, he was far better than I at strategy. Not that I couldn't have won with magic, but that would have just been pathetic. Such were my thoughts as we neared the city, and the hour or so of marching that still remained passed in a blur, as it was decided we would not ride ahead of the army following us, so that the people could be given a small parade for the victory, which of course included a chosen group of Kagan Moore militia, their arms and armour polished to shining the night before, and of course a troop of 500 of my own sworn mer, whose armour needed no such care. The gates opened before us, and Sarano and myself rode into the city side by side, the other nobles following closely behind, while the soldiery marched in practiced lockstep just behind them. And as news had already been sent ahead, the crowds knew to cheer their hearts out in greeting. I could still feel a few apprehensive and even hateful glances directed my way, but frankly, they were so irrelevant it was more amusing than anything. A private reception was, of course, organized within the great palace itself, where Serrano made a short speech honoring every leader, minor or otherwise, involved within the operation and thanking them in the name of all of Resdine. The usual platitudes, in short. And while the food was most interesting indeed, my attention was quickly grabbed by other guests who had arrived long before us, namely the leaders of two other great houses. Dagoth, a rather old yet vigorous Dunmer, greets me bluntly. I raise an eyebrow at the curt tone, Demnavani. He just stares at me for a good 10 seconds before realizing I wasn't about to answer his unasked question, "How did you do it?" "Ah, so that is what this is about. Do what, my good man?" Rather quickly, though not quickly enough for me to not notice, he grabs me by the shoulders. "The damnable automator, you bastard." He tries to shake me while hissing manically and fails miserably. I've been trying to make my own for centuries, and here you come shitting them out by the thousands. Honestly, I could understand the frustration. The man had dedicated uncountable years, still incomprehensible to me, even as I became something more, to a task only to see another overtake him with barely any effort. Naturally, I chose to make it worse, skill issue. The poor fucker looked like I just stabbed him in the heart as he just slumped his shoulders, his apprentice looking at him worriedly while directing terrified glances my way every few seconds. Right, Baladas Demnavani straightens himself in an instant. "I guess I will just have to make you tell me." A loud facepalm draws our eyes to the short figure of Vels Carvani. "By the gods, Baladas, calm yourself." "Calm myself?" The Archmagister rounds on his nominal subordinate. "Yes." The far too toothy elf grins. "You are being an embarrassment." Subtly signaling to Serrano that no fight was about to break out, I rejoin the conversation. "I never said the cooperation we agreed to was void." The old elf's eyes brighten. "Though the value of the knowledge will obviously need to be met by actions of your own." The Archmagister blinks before giving me a look of pure fucking disappointment. "You want to waste it on house business, and to think I was actually starting to respect you." "Well, that is a shame." I sigh dramatically. "Say, Carvani, would you be interested in—" "As I was saying," Demnavani interrupts, his entire demeanor shifting once again, "I would be delighted to discuss cooperation between our two houses." "Excellent." I grin. "No need to brain him anymore, Junior." "A pity." My greatest tonal creation rumbles from behind the old elf, somehow going unnoticed until now. Demnavani rounds on him, his eyes suddenly laser-focused as he stared up straight into Akulakan's eyes. "You." He somehow manages to loom even with his completely average stature. "You are no living being." With each moment, realization began dawning within the Archmagister's gaze, and he took short but certain steps around Junior, examining him and muttering to himself in an increasingly manic manner. "My master," Akulakan speaks up after a while, "is the meatbag attempting some kind of mating ritual?" Baladas ignores him utterly, somehow managing to make a literal machine increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. I just snort and shake my head, wordlessly telling Carvani to make sure his liege didn't do anything too idiotic, much to the toothy elf's chagrin. A curious thing, no? An old female voice draws my attention, the seemingly unassuming noblewoman having almost managed to sneak up on me without notice. "Lord Demnavani's mechanophilia, or my creation?" I ask, bemused. The old woman sniffs with amusement. "Not quite, though now that you mention it, that would explain why the Archmagister remains childless." She pretends to shiver, a rather unfortunate train of thought that. One that I shall promptly erase from my mind. I nod decisively. "Probably wise." She chuckles, though again, not exactly what I was getting at. I give her a curious look. "And what did you mean, oh mysterious lady?" "Cheeky," she chastises. "What I meant, oh youthful lordling, is that somehow, the moment you step into Morrowind, we find ourselves arranging the fastest conclave since the invasion. A complete unknown, barging into our lands and demanding we hear his words." She scoffs, and worst of all the fact we are all forced to listen. "You do not sound all that offended by the notion," I point out, a cup of Hasseldor's wine appearing within my hands as I offered one to her. She accepts it with the slightest upturn of her lip. And why should I? She takes a long sip, something rather telling of her care for noble posturing. "A mere 200 years ago, my house was just a minor retainer to the Hlalu, and now look at us." Sindral Sadras states openly that another one of us with the power and will to shake up this fossil of a nation came up is honestly a good thing in my books. "Rather enterprising of you, Lady Sadras." I incline my head as a sign of respect. "Some may judge you for such swift acceptance, however." "Oh, please," She rolls her eyes, pure disdain in her voice. If you were anything like those fools, you wouldn't even bother speaking with me. Not incorrect, since my own family name was among the oldest still living that have not been outright replaced by their branch houses. I was quite literally the old blood of the old blood in this place, even if the fact was but a technicality. As amusing as this dance is, I turn to her fully. To what do I owe your attention? Can't an old woman see what the young'uns are up to now and then? She smirks but goes on. You aren't a fool, child. I came here to see who you were and how you thought. Never hurts to agree to act before things get messy. Expecting the conclave to turn into a mess, are you? I quirk an eyebrow. She gives me the patented old woman, who are you trying to bullshit? And says, I do hear that dear old Neremir will be running a bit late, what with his pleasure barge barely floating under his weight. Interesting, I hum. Not a terrible guess, I will give her that much. The troops needed a bit of time to rest anyway. I am certain that is true. She hums along. Now that the boring politics are out of the way. She pauses. How about you and I have a long and productive conversation about that Skyrim trade, eh? My pile of gold has been growing shallow recently, and that is just poor for an old woman's sleep. And that is how I ended up spending 6 hours talking to a money-hungry hag, setting in motion events that would turn the Sea of Ghosts into one of the most lucrative routes in Tamriel. With enough time, of course. The following days passed me by in a relative blur, most of which I spent exploring the city and discussing things with my peers. The famous hedge mazes dotting the city were quite well ordered and maintained as well, which made for a rather interesting excursion, even if it was utterly ruined by my unnaturally honed sense of space. Another event of note was Savos dragging me off to the docks one day and showing off a small manor. The building was rather humble and barely worthy of being called more than a mere house, but I soon found out why it was still held under the property of the House of Aaron. It was Savos's old place, one he had been avoiding for the past 2 centuries, and one he had finally found the courage to face. We spent the entire night there, in the manor's basement, as my grandfather came face to face with his long-dead wife and apologized for all his self-perceived failings, only to be forgiven instantly, the elven woman far more interested in meeting her grandson instead, a fact I would mock the poor old man with till the end of his days. By the end of the visit, Savos Aaron stepped out of his old home with a surety in his steps I could barely recognize. The fading embers within his eyes set alight once more. It was nice. A full week after we had arrived, the next house leader showed up in a grand war galley bearing the chain of the Dres. The second youngest of all of us, she chose to wait for the actual conclave before doing any politicking, no doubt seeking an opportunity to take advantage of. Sadly for her idea of using her sudden arrival to her advantage, we were forced to wait for 3 full days longer before the fat piece of lard that was Indaril Neremir chose to finally waddle his way into Blacklight. Seeing the utter disgust on Alandro's face as he observed his liege lord was quite telling of how far Nerevar's original house had fallen. The Indaril requested an additional day of rest that Serrano was obligated to host him for, and the moment the sun rose the next morning, all 6 of us made our way to the root spire in the center of the city. The time of the conclave had come. What are you plebes gawking at? Back to the pit. Chapter 430, Chapter L, The Conclave of Resdain. General P.O.F. The root spire of Blacklight was an ancient edifice towering over the rest of the city by a wide margin. Once the home of a powerful mage, now the nominal seat of Morrowind itself, said to have been blessed by the direct touch of the good Daedra once its new function was chosen. Its hallowed halls were eerily silent as the once 5, now 6 titled leaders of beloved Morrowind marched their way up its winding staircases, having left their guards and followers in a lower chamber, as only they could ascend to the summit. The odd atmosphere of the tower grew with each step taken, instilling a solemnity into the great elves none of them could easily shake off. Well, most of them anyway, for one of their number could not care less for the ever-present Daedric aura surrounding him, Raven's point of view. Neat trick, I make an effort not to roll my eyes as I step into the large chamber atop the tower, within which awaited a large round table surrounded by 6 seats, one of whom looked to be rather recently added. How nice of Sarano. I note the minor favor down and make my way to the throne marked with my own sigil, the rest of the lords and ladies doing much the same. The first and honestly most important of the lot was the aforementioned Varan Sarano. The overly scarred Dunmer had enough respect for me to agree to the broad strokes of my plans, but I suspect he may need a bit more of a push to support me fully. The next was Baladas Demnevani. The relatively unassuming, if ancient-looking, Telvanni archmage would be the easiest to get on side if he could be made to pay attention to anything not magic related for more than 10 minutes, that is. That the Telvanni still selected him to represent them all was rather telling of the entire house's mental state. Third in line came Indaril Neramir, and frankly I was not aware Dunmer, or elves in general, could ever get quite so fat. His chins had chins, for God's sake. The man was aged around what I guessed was his middle years and kept grumbling about having to leave his palace the whole way. I could hear him. I had yet to even talk to him, so here is to hoping he wasn't quite as stupid as he was corpulent. Rather naive of me, I know. Fourth came Sindril of the Sadras, looking older than Demnevani, but no doubt being far younger in truth. She was a businesswoman through and through, and thus already in my pocket. That Regnil turned out to be her great-grandson, and I helped him with keeping his head attached to his shoulders, was also a rather neat bonus. Still rather cheeky of the little fucker to hide the fact. And last but probably not least came Andreis of the Dres, only a decade older than myself, and thus not nearly as renowned or respected as the rest of them. She was saddled with the rebuilding of the nearly annihilated slaver house, and was likely to fully support my plans if she managed to get even part of her ancestral lands back in return. She'd probably bitch out when she learned I would not allow slavery to become a thing again, but that was for later Raven to worry about, and later Raven was probably going to be much more politically powerful than the current one. Seeing as they were all seated, and being the one to actually summon the conclave, I stood up and spoke. I thank you all for coming here on such short notice. The situation on our southern border has turned quite perilous, and it is only through sheer luck and the blessing of the gods that we managed to stop it from turning even worse. I summon the captured reports alongside a well-marked map of southern Morrowind, and with a flick of a hand unfurl it atop the table for all of them to see. As you can no doubt surmise, the attack was but the preamble, and both the reports and my own information indicate that the next wave will be reaching us within 2 months, when winter is in full effect and the Morrowind climate becomes far more bearable to the Argonians. Serrano nods along my conclusion, but says nothing. Do we know what prompted them? Andreis Dries speaks up. They did nothing for over 200 years, only to attack us out of nowhere. Indeed, Neramir Indaril interjects in an irritating drawl. My own reports mention minor raids at best for decades, and suddenly the Anzilil are acting up again. He shakes his head condescendingly, rather suspect, I dare say. We could speculate on their reasoning for days if we liked. I point out lazily, they could have allied with our cousins from Somerset in some attempt to preemptively pincer the Empire, or they could have just finally built up enough power to strike out. My eyes meet those of the fat one. In the end, does it even matter? Our lands will soon be under assault, and speculation will not strike back the enemy. He huffs. No, I suspect not. Twat is trying to find an excuse for something, Scorch points out. Quite, I drawl, the word directed at both targets. Now how about instead of pondering why the lizards are throwing themselves at us, we discuss an actual plan of action? They were obviously acting out due to the Empire growing in power and coherence with worrying speed and would soon threaten everyone. But I wasn't about to inform my fellow High Lords of that. So long as it does not involve me having to ask my subjects. Demnevani speaks up with a tone as dry as his homeland. To leave their homes completely defenseless, House Telvanni is ready and willing to finance all battle-ready mages we can. A lot of the younger fools are thirsty for Argonian blood after listening to the stories for decades, so don't worry, I will persuade at least a few hundred of them to throw their lives away. He tacks on as the Dres and Redoran give him looks of doubt. That he simply accepted a combined intervention as fact would set the tone for the rest of the conversation, something I would probably have to reward him for with a schematic or 3. A worthy sacrifice. I hum aloud and give him a pointed look. 500 at the very least, and at high adept level of combat, useful spells minimum. This was not me commanding him, but giving him an obvious option to take before the other houses started bitching about him, not fully committing. Something he accepted quite happily. Telvanni independence was good for individual magi, but it wreaked havoc on the effectiveness of the house itself. Sarano, who looked just about ready to demand much the same as I, gave a curt nod, which was soon followed by Andreis. Said Grand Magnate spoke up next. We obviously all agree that the invasion needs heading off, but how exactly do you expect us to do it without being outmaneuvered by the beasts? The southern border is vast. Quite simple, actually. I grin. We attack them and retake Mournhold. A long pause ensues as my words settle. Sindral sucks in a breath. You certainly don't aim low, child. Rather ambitious, yes. Serrano nods slowly, but not completely foolish. Demnavani just snorts, probably having expected me to do something he thought outrageous. Indaril's face darkens for whatever reason, but he remains silent. Drez, on the other hand, seems skeptical. Do they not have a massive numbers advantage? They do, I confirm easily enough. However, it is nearly impossible for them to engage all of said numbers at once, due to a simple lack of maneuverability. They may have 100,000 or more warriors, but they are also liable to position them all across the border to attack us, which will make a counterattack incredibly effective. Also, I add, if we were to storm Mournhold, we would both get a powerful base of operations to strike at them from, while also reconquering our people's true capital, greatly boosting morale among our followers. She frowns but soon nods. I can see the advantages. But you remain unconvinced. She nods and I smirk. You will be happy to hear then that I will be providing my automatons for carrying our supplies, something I have no doubts the Lady Sadras will have no difficulty in procuring. The old woman barely contains a greedy grin. I am unfamiliar with these, Drez points out. With a shrug, I explain, think of it as tireless, mindless servants of considerable physical capability, uncaring for terrain or food. And of course, the leader of the ex-slaver house understands that instantly. And who would be leading this excursion? Serrano finally asks the truly important question, his gaze suddenly much sharper than earlier. Before I answer that, I believe it is time for me to speak of the other reason I called for you all. I say, a bit more serious now, you have all heard of Azura's most recent prophecy, yes? The moment I mention the name, the tower shimmers with Daedric power. All 5 of them now knew that if before they were not being watched now, they most certainly were. All of them give nods of varying enthusiasm. Indeed. Serrano is the one to speak, his tone a ponderous one. Her words were far more direct than I have ever known them to be, allegedly backed by the other 2. Ashlander hogwash. Neremir scoffs, his eyes intently focusing on me. Well, whether you choose to believe it or not, I was in fact sent here by the 3. I reveal simply, there was really no point in hiding it here where they could all feel their very presence. All of them probably knew that much, as no sound was made for a few seconds before a pleasant aura spread through the tower and disappeared as quickly as it came, causing a downright furious frown on the Indaril. So what you are saying is, Drez says carefully, you did not come to tie us to your imperial masters. Masters? I quirk an eyebrow and shake my head, unwilling to get caught up in that particular line of questioning. I was in no rush to return to my ancestral homeland. No, I only half lie. The 3 were rather insistent on my coming, however. Is there an actual point in any of this? Sindral asks, hiding her frustration rather well under the sarcasm, as the talk of Daedra made her visibly uncomfortable. Simply put, I ask aloud, the moment I stepped into Morrowind, I thought I had come to hell, not home. The land is barren, the people poor, the villages abandoned, and the cities destitute. I let out a derisive snort. Frankly, part of me thought it best to leave it all to the Argonians, since at least they would be hard-headed enough to fix it with enough blood and sweat. I will listen to no more of this drivel. Neremir stands up suddenly, nearly falling backwards under the sudden force, but managing to right himself in time. You summon us here like mere servants, and have the audacity to criticize our work while suffering none of the difficulties. No more, I say. My house and I will have no part in this foolishness, especially not under a fucking noir. Midway through his rant, I found myself massaging the bridge of my nose, but the moment he tried to hit me with the old reliable, my hand was already raised in a particular manner, and in an instant the shadows behind Neremir shifted. The fat Indoril tried screaming as a metal garrote was wrapped around his neck, but all he managed was a pained gurgle before he drowned in his own blood. The entire chamber exploded into action, with Demnavani levitating up and warding himself and Sindril, while Andreis and Varan drew their blades to face the assassin. Only I remained completely at ease, standing exactly where I had been for the entire meeting. Neremir's body topples forward, his head slamming into the table and revealing the armored form of Davos, who was completely silent as he held the garrote in one hand and a long unfurled scroll, noting down in obnoxious detail all of Neremir's crimes and failings, courtesy of Mephala herself. No one says a thing, and only after a few dozen seconds does Varan take a cautious step towards the guildsman, likely knowing exactly what was going on, and yanks the scroll from my right-hand mare's grasp. He steps back in a lightly blurred movement, ensures he is not about to be attacked, and begins reading it all over. The moment he finishes reading it, he gives me a look. Are you truly this bold, or merely hubristic, I wonder? What is it? Demnavani asks with a frown. A writ of honourable execution. I calmly answer instead of the Redaran. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt since one of his kinsmen came to my aid, even when word was that dear Neremir stated otherwise. I look down at the corpse. He has proven himself unworthy of such considerations. Ha! Sindril scoffs, serves the fat bastard right. The writ is slowly passed through the rest of them, and Davos is ever so cautiously given the permission to leave, though not before getting glared near to death by the rather shaken Andreis, my right-hand Mer still not uttering a single word as he closed the door behind him. You are not fools. I speak up after Davos leaves. It is rather obvious what I am after, and the death of the Indoril idiot should tell you just how far I am willing to go to achieve it. The very air shifts as they focus on me again. My eyes slowly meet theirs, my divinity slowly bubbling to the surface as I made them feel a presence akin to the vaguest hint of the Daedra, but different and unique in its own right. I have told you of my disgust when I first arrived to what was supposed to be my beloved ancestral home, the very gods guiding me back, even as I hesitated to come myself. I pause and spread my arms. Simply put, the state of things as it is unacceptable. All I see in these lands is what has for centuries been and is still being left to rot, and I refuse to stomach it a moment longer. I will fix this once majestic land, whether you help me on the way, or I am forced to drag you with me, kicking and screaming. Cue frowns and calculative looks. None of them were going to have another outburst after what just happened, even if Neremir was by every single one of them considered worthy of a writ already. But I do not expect you to simply roll over and accept my authority as your leader. I shake my head. No, I understand that something must be done so that I may prove both my intention and my power, and victory in battle alone is not enough. What exactly do you propose? Varan asks, his entire posture still tense from recent events. What deed makes you so confident as to demand the position of Hortator so openly? Simple. I offer a kindly smile. In return for your allegiance, I offer the simplest of gifts. I pause before flashing the entirety of my power, shaking the tower and locking all of them in place briefly. I will calm Red Mountain itself.